I'm a cemetery operations coordinator, or you can just call me a cemetery manager. Part of my job is sitting down with guests and family members of the deceased to set up funerals, facilitate the sales of plots, etc. A 30-something-year-old man named Antonio, very spiritual man, once sat down with me to purchase a plot for his sick father who was in hospice care. Antonio was a Hispanic man with a very thick accent, and I saw in his eyes he was a very caring man. He showed me pictures of his father, who also looked like a very sweet man, much too young to be taken away from his family. But unfortunately, the man's time came that same week, and Antonio arranged for his father's funeral service at the cemetery. It was a very stormy day, the day of the funeral, which is thought to be a sign of good luck. The funeral procession stopped in front of the front office building briefly. I stepped outside under the front awning of the building and saw Antonio in the car behind the hearse. We waved at each other. Due to the weather, I went back inside until the procession was ready to proceed to the burial site. I got in one of the cemetery pickup trucks and followed the procession to the final stop, where I would stand with my umbrella supervising, as part of my job is making sure funeral services go smoothly. After the funeral, I did some laps around the place in the truck just to survey the area, as I did at least a couple times a day. I had a lot of paperwork to take care of, and on top of this, I had to close the cemetery that night. So a little later, I went back to my desk and took care of this. The cemetery closes at 5:30, so as soon as it started to get dark, I drove around the place one more time to ensure all visitors had left, then drove over to the front gate to shut it. It was a relatively warm early March. The days were still on the shorter side, so by closing time on a normal day, it would already be getting darker. But on this stormy-ass day, it already felt like it was nighttime. I was driving back to my office when I thought I saw someone hurriedly walking down one of the lanes of tombstones before turning behind a hedge and disappearing out of sight. I beeped my horn so as to let them know the place was closed, but strangely enough, I didn't see them again. I grabbed my umbrella and ran out into the rain in that direction. I turned beyond the hedge he turned at and looked down this long row of tombstones on one side and hedges on the other. I didn't see anyone. I looked around in the rain for a solid 20 minutes, but eventually I had to give up. I drove back up to the office and browsed through the CCTV footage. None of it picked up on any unusual movement, even though it was a bit harder to see much because of the storm and it was also pitch black outside now. I tried to multitask, keeping an eye on the camera while finishing up some of my paperwork, when I heard the front door to the visitation room slam shut. I sprang up from my chair and yelled, "Hello?" My first thought was that it was the same person I saw before. Maybe they got locked in the cemetery and were looking for assistance in leaving. I stepped out into the lobby, but no one was there. I looked around and again said, "Hello?" Maybe the door slamming shut was them leaving. I started looking out all the windows, and I stopped when at one of them, I saw someone on the other side, looking back at me, with a blank expression. I jumped back and screamed, and they didn't flinch. I stepped closer and made a squinty-eyed, confused look when I realized I recognized this Hispanic, older-looking man. In my head, it reminded me exactly of the pictures of Antonio's father he showed me. With my heart in my throat, I ran out the front door of the building and to the side where I saw the man, but he was gone. He wasn't booking it into the fields, he wasn't hiding in a bush nearby, he was gone. I looked around me as I stood in the rain getting soaked, then ran back inside, packed up my things, locked up, and got in my car. I opened and closed the gate, once more locking it behind me, and drove home. When my wife asked me at home why I was being so quiet, I just told her, long day at work. To this day, I think I was just overworking myself, and my mind was playing tricks on me, but it still is genuinely disturbing to think about. My name is Jeremy. This was in the dead of October, chilly and windy. I live in a somewhat big town. It's very poor and old, early 18th century type buildings. A friend and I were bored one night and decided to go fuck around at 3 a.m. I know that going out at 3 a.m. in a poor town isn't exactly smart, but we like to have our fun. We got bored of driving around blasting our music. We're both very big metalheads, and at that point we had our own band. So we decided it would be interesting and cool to walk around a cemetery in the town. Behind the old town square, there's a massive cemetery. It's divided by two sides of a highway, both sides taking up about 20 acres of land. As I said, it's massive. We decided to check out the older part of the cemetery. This part is completely separated from the rest of the newer cemetery with an old iron fence and gate. We get to walking around and checking out the cemetery, trying to read the old moss-covered graves, taking pictures, being a little bit disrespectful, I know. But these were graves from at least a century ago, so there was no one living that would be upset by it, and I'm sure the people in the graves didn't mind too much. After about an hour of checking it out, we sit down next to a giant pecan tree in the middle of the old cemetery. That's when we hear this little girl laughing. It was really close to us. At first I assumed maybe it was a toy left on a child's grave or something like that. I'm not one to scare easily, so I just figured it's motion activated or something like that. We are not at all easy to scare, so we both sort of laugh, pointing out that it's creepy and just keep talking and enjoying the ambiance. Then, as in all stories like this, I get the feeling of something or someone watching me. Once again, I just figured that I was letting the entire thing get into my head. Then my friend says he thinks he sees someone in the shadows of a small wooded area right next to the cemetery, of which we were really close. At this point, we're both a little creeped out and decide to get up and leave. Then that noise, the exact same noise, played again, and we hear leaves crunching underneath the feet of someone. That's when we booked it. We ran down the hill leading to the old part of the cemetery, down where my car was parked. I've never ran that fast in my life. It sounded like that laughing noise was following us at that point. We both sort of just went into full fight or flight mode at that point, going as fast as we could without thinking. The noises behind us stopped as we got to my car. I started my car and put it in drive, pulling out into the highway without looking. Luckily no one hit us. We get down the road to the only gas station that's open at this time of night to check in the back of my car. We had both been discussing how we were scared some shit had been done to it. We get around to check and immediately find the back door is open. I know for a fact neither of us ever opened it. There was no reason for us to open it. I look in the back seats, make sure nothing's there, get right back in the car and peel out. I'm still confused about what happened that night. I'm not sure if we both overreacted or what. All I know is that I still feel that weird feeling that something is behind you whenever I tell this story. When I was 19, my friend Sean, who was a big goofball, came over to chill in our basement as he often would during the summer. I remember he had a Coke bottle in his hand and I was eating Wendy's when he said we should check out that creepy little cemetery across town. It was the most random idea ever, and I even told him that. Still, we had no school the next day, and I knew exactly which cemetery he was talking about. I don't know if one should even call it a regular cemetery. It's just a small plot of land with maybe 100 tombstones at most. The tombstone's very archaic looking, and any time we'd pass, there would be no signs of anyone having come to visit within the last decade. The site probably dated back centuries, and it had this super creepy vibe to it because it was closed off by a gothic metal fence, and it was surrounded by woods on two sides, the road on one, and some old abandoned building on the other. Everything about it just gave scary vibes. It took a little persuading, but Sean managed to get me to want to check it out too. Ironically, it was a very cloudy, wettish kind of day, I guess conveniently adding to the mood. Sean pulled up his Honda to the side of the road. I told him to pull up more so it wasn't obvious. This was a low traffic road, so it would look kind of suspicious. He pulled up a few hundred feet down the road, and we got out and cut through the woods so that any potential passing traffic wouldn't see us entering the little cemetery. Hopping the fence in the woods was easy. It was maybe a 3 or 4 foot fence. Sean kind of took the lead on this since it was mainly his venture. He led us through the eerie little plot of land, and we looked at the archaic tombstones. They all seemed to be from the 19th century. The writing on some of them was illegible at that point. I know it sounds super dumb and cliche, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched constantly. I started looking around the surrounding woods. I told Sean how creepy this was. "I know," he replied. Still, with the feeling of being watched, I looked at the abandoned building next to the cemetery, at one of the windows. For a brief moment, I knew I saw someone standing at the window, even through the fog, smudge, and dirt on the glass, but they casually either ducked or walked away from the window. I told Sean we were being watched by someone in that building, and he turned to look at it as well. Then he went to look for the entrance to it. I told him don't. I said we should just leave before we get in trouble. I stayed still by the tombstone he was looking at while he walked around the building, and then he found a way in. He called me over, but I stayed put. Then I heard some loud kind of crack, so I looked in that direction, and there was this older man, probably around 55. Gray hair, had on a black raincoat, I believe he was wearing jeans, and he had a mustache, but that's all I really got of him. Then he opened his mouth and screamed, not just yelled, he screamed, "Get out." He screamed it so loud I thought I saw birds fly away from being startled. And just like that, I started to feel lightheaded, and suddenly everything went dark. The next thing I remember was waking up to being dragged in the woods. I freaked out thinking I was being kidnapped, but when I turned and got up, I saw it was just Sean. Sean was freaking out about something. He told me to follow him and run back to the car, so I didn't ask questions. As we ran through the woods, I heard something close behind me, and when I turned, I realized we were being followed by someone, so I ran even faster. We got to his Honda, and he basically put it in drive before the car even had a chance to fully start. When Sean was inside that abandoned building, he found a sigil of Baphomet painted on the wood floor, which is basically the sign of Satan. Around it were a bunch of freaky dolls with buttons for eyes. He didn't get to see anything else in the building, because he heard the old man scream at me outside. He came running to find me passed out on the floor, and he saw the old man slowly walking over to me. He started to drag me away from the old man and into the woods. He actually literally picked me up and threw me over the fence to get me out. I quickly came back to consciousness, and that's when we ran. I had only fainted one time in my life, and it was at that moment. I don't know why I fainted, but it happening at a graveyard with some kind of satanic ritual building right next to it makes it that much stranger. My grandpa passed away a few years ago. I was always very close with him. This past July, on his birthday, I paid him a visit at the cemetery. The cemetery he and my grandma chose to be buried at was about an hour drive from my apartment. My family lived closer, so they all went to his grave together. I had to go separately. It was a rainy, depressing day, and there's nothing worse than visiting a cemetery on a gloomy day. The gatekeeper of the gate asked for the plot number. I gave it to him and he let me in. It's a pretty big cemetery, and I'd only been there a couple other times. Not as the driver though, so I had a hard time finding it. I didn't see many other people, if any, at the cemetery that day. I'm sure the weather had something to do with it. Eventually I found his stone and parked my car in the grass to the side. I put some flowers down under his stone, stood there for a while with my eyes closed, and prayed. When I finished my prayer, I opened my eyes and looked up. There was an old man standing about 5 rows of graves down, but directly across from me, and he was looking right at me. I knew this man though. It was my grandfather. But no, it couldn't be. I rubbed my eyes and he was gone. Did I just have a spiritual moment? Or were my eyes and mind playing tricks on me? Either way, I got the chills and I had goosebumps. I was quite honestly freaked out. I got back in my car, said, "Love you, Grandpa," and drove off. I felt like I had a headache on my way home. Not sure why. I was the only car on Prospect Road, a quiet road with dense forest on either side. Commonly, there would be deer crossing here. As my car zipped down the road, I spotted someone on the side of the road coming up, which was odd. There were no sidewalks or a walking path on this road. I slowed down, and it couldn't be. It looked like my grandpa again. When I realized this, my heart dropped 1,000 feet, and I swerved the car accidentally. I desperately tried to regain control and come to a stop. Luckily, my car didn't end up in a tree, rather just skidded out in the middle of the road until coming to a halt. I immediately looked back to where I saw him, and I saw a deer on the side of the road, looking at my car. My heart was literally racing. I was terrified. I was not well, and I needed to get home. I made sure no cars were coming and got back in my lane. I focused on the road as best I could given what I had just seen twice. I felt weird the rest of the day. Not sick, but something wasn't right with my head. I went to bed early after watching an episode of my show. I woke up at like 2 in the morning to my phone ringing. It was an unknown number. My heart started racing again. Any call at this hour couldn't be good news. I accepted the call and put the phone up to my ear. There was static on the other end. Finally, I said, "Hello?" More static. But what I thought I heard next, I couldn't believe. Just briefly, for maybe half a second, I thought I heard my grandpa's voice over the static. I tried to say hello again, but I was too shook. Every part of my body was actually shaking. Then the call cut to silence and ended. I called my phone provider the next day to trace the number. They couldn't. They didn't have enough data to trace it apparently, though I don't know if that was just bullshit or not. The events that took place that day and night were the scariest I've ever experienced. Do I think my dead grandpa was trying to contact me? I don't know, because that sounds ridiculous. You'd think if you experienced something like this, you'd be so full of emotion and joy. But no, it still terrifies me, and I really still don't know what to think or how to feel about it. Whether it sounds ridiculous or not, this happened, and I wonder almost every other night, was that really my grandpa on the phone? My friends and I were very stupid when we were teenagers. I was like 17 or 18 when this happened. It was the month of October, and I wanted to do something scary in the spirit of Halloween. There's a small cemetery about 10 minutes from where I live, and when I was drunk with a couple friends, I said we should sneak into it. I'll make up some names for my friends, Ryan and Mike. We were at Ryan's house. He didn't drink ever. So when I came up with the idea, he was the one to drive us to the cemetery. Mike and I were really the ones leading this. Ryan was just along for the ride. But then again, he hadn't been drinking. Ryan parked in some parking lot across the street. It was a ghost town because it was past midnight at that point. We made sure no one was around to see us as we hopped the fence into the cemetery. It wasn't exactly pitch black out, but it was slightly hard to see more than 10 feet in front of us. So we were all using our iPhone flashlights. There didn't appear to be any night security in the cemetery, so we kind of dispersed from each other. Ryan seemed to be following Mike more closely. I could still see where they were because of their flashlights. I went off a little further on my own, and I decided I'd start taking a creepy video. So I started recording with the light still on, of course. I recorded a bunch of old headstones and the general eerie vibe of the cemetery at night. I didn't see Mike and Ryan anymore, so I started to go look for them, still recording. I looked at my phone screen and froze. There was a woman, dressed in a white gown or dress I want to say, with long, gray-looking hair. She was looking down at the ground. I looked up from my phone screen to look at her in person, but she was gone. I started to back away. I looked back at my phone screen, and there she was again. Only now she was looking into the camera, or rather looking at me. I looked up from the phone again and could not see her once more, so I looked back down at the screen again, and there I could see her moving closer to me. I started to scream for Mike and Ryan as I sprinted away from that spot. I couldn't see their lights anywhere, and they weren't answering my screams. I had a feeling they were going to try to scare me, so I ran back for the fence of the cemetery to hop it and get out. I made it to Ryan's car and texted the two of them saying they need to get out of the cemetery now. They met me at the car minutes later. We all sat in the car, and I showed them the video I took. They had the same horrified looks on their faces I did. Now that I was actually watching the whole video, I could see the moment the woman slowly lifted her head from looking at the ground to looking at me, and then she starts to move towards me. We could only see her moving for like a second or two before I start screaming in the video and running away. But the way she was moving, we could see no leg movement. It almost seemed as though she were floating to me. I have that video saved on my old iPhone 4S, but the stupid thing won't turn on. It gets stuck at the Apple logo. I don't want to reset that phone until I can get that video off of it somehow. My friends firmly believe the woman in the video was a real, living person who also happened to be in the cemetery that night. But me, having been the one to actually find her, and only being able to see her on my phone screen, well, let's just say I was never a believer in the paranormal until that night.
Number 5. Last night, a friend rushed me out of the house to catch the opening act at a local bar's music night. After a few drinks, I realized my phone wasn't in my pocket. I checked the table we were sitting at the bar, the bathrooms, and after no luck, I used my friend's phone to call mine. After 2 rings, someone answered, gave out a low, raspy giggle, and hung up. They didn't answer again. I eventually gave it up as a lost cause and headed home. I found my phone laying on my nightstand, right where I left it. Number 4. When I was a kid, I was always the last kid to get picked up by the bus driver to go to school. One day I was waiting for the bus by myself and a bus with no kids pulled up. The bus driver smiled and told me to hop on. I just had a bad feeling. I said, "Where are the other kids?" He said, "We will go get them now. Just get on." He got more and more pushy but didn't do anything crazy. I just kept saying no and he shrugged and left. The real bus pulled up a few minutes later. I went to school and my parents didn't know until I mentioned it that night. Looking back, they were pretty worried. I remember them scrambling to make a few phone calls. Number 3. A few years back, I rented an apartment from a friend of mine. He had recently bought it and had it completely renovated. He put it up for sale but couldn't find a buyer, so I offered to rent it in the meantime. After moving in, I realized there was something wrong with the lady next door. She was about 45 but looked much older. She would sit up all night listening to Christian radio shows and talking loudly to someone. It got to the point where I couldn't sleep, so I went over to her place and asked her to keep it down. She opened the door and I got a quick peek. Her walls all had crosses painted on them in different colors, and words like Jesus and angels scribbled everywhere. The windows were painted black, letting no light in at all. It was damp, yellow-stained 50-year-old carpets, dog shit, and cockroaches everywhere. No dog, though. I asked her to please keep it down. She just looked at me and shut the door. Then she turned up the radio even louder. The next night I had my girlfriend staying over. I wake up in the middle of the night and see a shadow of a person next to the bed, looking at us sleeping. I think I'm hallucinating, as I usually do in the dark when I'm sleepy. But then the shadow starts talking. It's my neighbor and she's holding something in her hand. She broke in during the night and who knows how long she stood there. "You should lock your doors at night," she says and walks out. The next morning, I hear someone making strange noises below my bedroom window. It's my neighbor talking to herself in tongue. She has a plastic bag in her hand with her rotting dead dog inside. It's hot as hell outside and I can smell death from that bag. At this point, I'm scared shitless. She's obviously very insane. I go upstairs and knock on another person's door and ask them what the hell is going on. The guy is as scared as me. Apparently, she broke into his apartment one evening as well while he was watching TV with his kids. He got up from the couch to get a snack, only to find her behind the couch, staring at him holding a power drill. Come to think about it, now I know what was in her hand. At this stage, I'm basically shitting myself. I call the cops and they know all about her. Apparently she's a violent schizophrenic and she hasn't taken her meds. But they can't force her or enter her apartment without her permission because she owns it. The only thing they can do is get her when she goes outside. I sit up for the next 2 days, waiting for her to run out of cigarettes. When I hear her leave at 2 a.m. to go across the road to the 7-Eleven, I call the cops. They have 3 cars and a special van over in less than 2 minutes. They restrain her and throw her in the van and drive off to some institution, and in less than a minute, it's like she was never there. I never see her again. Still have nightmares about her looking at me in my sleep. Number 2. I was about 15 minutes from finishing the night shift at work when there was a massive crash on one of the windows in the office, so I get up and go check it out. Someone has thrown quite a sizable rock through one of the windows on the front of the building. This is made especially weird because I'm working in the industrial district at 11:30 at night with none of the other businesses open. I go back to my desk, put a quick call through to security to let them know, and decide to head home. As I'm leaving the building, I'm freaking myself out about it more and more and end up running to my car, getting in and taking off. I'm almost home and I've started to calm down a bit when I realize that I didn't unlock my car when I got in. It had been unlocked the whole time. I do a quick check with my hand in the back seat for any possible murderers that might be hanging around there, but there's nothing there. Fast forward about 30 minutes. I've called a friend of mine who says he's out drinking, so I decide I'm going to join him. I jump on my bicycle and start riding over. I'm doodling along the road on my bike. It's a nice night and I'm in no big rush, just enjoying the moonlight when I hear someone riding behind me. I straighten up and stick to one side of the road. He passes me really slowly, and when he's right beside me, he shoots me a smile, and I can describe it as purely insane. I kind of flinch and am taken aback as he rides on. That's when I realize he's riding my mom's bike. Needless to say, I sprint the hell home. When I get there, sure enough, her bike is missing and one of my car's doors is open. The back left one. I was driving and had no need to open that door. Number 1. I worked at a campground on night shift, 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. every night. It wasn't bad. I would bring in my PS2 and game a good portion of the night, only having to deal with 1 or 2 people on busy nights. It was just me in this little 8-foot by 8-foot shack, with nothing around but dark all night. My first week there, the other third shift guy who was quitting told me about this payphone a few feet from the shack where I worked. He said it rang every night at 4:17 a.m., just once. It was probably just an automated test call, he guessed. He's never answered it himself. I go for a few months with the job. It was the middle of the summer, so most nights I had the windows closed, so I couldn't hear the payphone go off. Mid-August, I started leaving the windows open during the night. Sure enough, at 4:17 a.m. every morning, the phone would ring once. The ring even sounded creepy, like the payphone was submerged in water and then put where it sat. One night I got up the nerve to answer it. I set an alarm at 4:15 and would go wait at the phone until it rang. When it did, I answered it, but there was no sound, just dead air like someone was on the other line but wasn't answering. I said hello a few times and hung up. I did this every night for a week with the same results. I didn't think anything of it and left it alone after that for about a month. The first week of October, I decided to answer the phone once again. I set my alarm and when the time came, I answered the phone. I repeatedly said hello into the phone. Then I heard what sounded like someone inhaling through clenched teeth. The voice that sounded was rough and sounded like he had gargled gravel. He said my name, my complete name, first, middle, and last. It was a voice I've never heard. My voice caught in my throat and I hung up. I rattled some change into the payphone and hit *69. The number had come from California. I lived in Indiana.
There's a nice hidden lake a short walk away from my house in Parsonfield, Maine. I've been going fishing there for as long as I've lived here. It's hidden away from any roads or houses. It has perfect privacy, and I would always be the only one out on the lake fishing. In fact, I would leave my kayak in the same spot by the lake whenever I wasn't using it. It was easier than lugging the thing back and forth from my house to the lake anytime I wanted to use it. I would leave it leaning up against this huge tree every time. The kayak is heavy enough to not fall over from a windstorm or anything. I also leave it covered to prevent critters from taking refuge inside. It was a warm summer's evening. I was out on the lake already for about an hour, and I'd caught a few trout already, which I'd thrown into the cooler. It was dusk at this point. The little bit of light left in the sky was disappearing behind the trees. I was gonna bring it in soon, and just then, I heard sounds from the edge of the lake. I turned and saw someone standing at the edge of the water, tipping a barrel of some kind over, pouring its contents into the lake. It looked to me like they were polluting the lake with something. I took it upon myself to yell out, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" The person looked up at me, and he then ran into the woods, with the contents of the barrel still pouring into the water. I looked more closely at the liquid being poured out into the lake, and it looked like a dark red liquid. Though it was dark out, so I can't say with 100% certainty if it was red, but it was very dark. I felt a sense of unease creep up throughout my body. I decided I wanted to leave. I'm a big nature guy though, and seeing people littering or polluting the environment makes me sick. I genuinely couldn't resist shouting something out to that person, but I didn't feel comfortable here any longer. I planned on reporting this to the Department of Environmental Protection. I paddled the kayak back to my usual spot. I took all of my gear off the kayak before pulling it out of the water. As I was putting the cover over the kayak, I heard one single snap of something not far away, like the crunch of something under a person's shoe. I turned and was about to say who's there, but I decided against it. I finished covering the kayak quicker than I ever had before. I didn't even bother standing it up to lean on the tree this time. I left it on the ground. I picked up my gear and cooler and started quickly walking out of the woods and onto the road, which led to my house. It was only a couple minutes of a walk and I was back home. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire time though, thinking someone was behind me. I put my gear in the shed real quick, then went inside. I never locked the door so quickly. I was genuinely spooked. I rinsed off the trout and put them in the fridge, planning on cooking them tomorrow. Tonight, I just heated up some leftovers. As the food was in the microwave, there was a knock at my front door. The fear and dread that I was feeling the entire walk back to the house returned in an instant, and my suspicion that I was being followed home was basically confirmed. I mean, who else would be knocking on my door this late? My lights were on, my car was in the driveway, whoever it was knew I was in here. I had all the shades closed though, so nobody could look inside. They knocked on the door again. The microwave beeped as the timer hit 0. I'm sure whoever was outside heard it. All the windows were cracked open, and a moment later, there was a knock now on the window, and a man's voice said through the window, "Excuse me, I think you saw me at the lake earlier. I'd just like to explain myself." There was absolutely no chance I was opening the door to this person. For them to stalk me to my house told me this was a dangerous person. They repeatedly knocked on the window and kept yelling hello through it. I decided to acknowledge him now that he was getting more aggressive. I yelled, "Yo, leave or I'll call the police." I intended to either way, but it was still a threat to get him to leave. The man responded calmly now, saying, "Sir, if you could just open the front door, I'll explain everything to you." I repeated my threat, and I didn't hear his voice again. At this point, I shut and locked every window in the house and turned on the AC. I also made a report to the non-emergency police number, detailing both the barrel being dumped into the lake and the man coming to my house. I also made an online report with the Department of Environmental Protection. Making these 2 reports honestly made me feel a little better about going to sleep that night. But thank God I'm a light sleeper. In the middle of the night, like 2 a.m., I heard a crash from downstairs. I immediately sprang out of my bed and grabbed my Glock from the closet. I heard someone's attempt at quiet footsteps coming up the creaky wooden steps. I had my Glock loaded in hand as I stood behind my dresser right by my closet, aiming at the door. I heard very slow creeping towards my door. My bedroom door is closest to the stairs, so it was naturally the first door that they would approach. And sure enough, I heard the doorknob slowly press down, and then the door pushed open. I saw nothing but the man's silhouette enter the room. I flicked on the lamp next to me so he could see my gun, and I screamed, "Get on the ground now." He raised his hands in the air and seemed for a second to be motioning for me to calm down. He had a small blade in his hand. I told him to drop it, but then he said calmly, "I'm leaving," and he turned and ran for downstairs. I yelled at him to stop, but he clearly took the chance on me being too afraid to pull the trigger. I heard him leave through the front door. I ran downstairs to lock the front door right away and then call 911. My living room window was shattered. Glass was all over the floor. I kept my sight on that broken window until the police officers showed up. I had to explain that I already made a non-emergency report of what happened earlier. In fear of waiting too long by morning for the barrel to be gone, in the darkness, I went with 2 of the officers who showed up to my house to where I saw that man dumping the barrel into the lake. But after 20 minutes of walking around looking for it, it was gone. The man must have made sure not to leave it behind. I gave my best description of the man to the police for their report. The man was a short, bearded white man with a receding hairline and glasses, wearing a black flannel shirt and black pants. After the police left, I stayed in the living room all night with my gun next to me, watching TV. No way in hell was I going to sleep with a broken window and some nut job out there. At dawn, my brothers came over to help me fix the window. My brother Dale stayed at the house while my other brother and I went to Home Depot to get the window and parts. Dale stayed at the house with me for a few nights till things cooled down. My not-so-wild theory is that the barrel contained human remains, possibly dissolved in some kind of acid. Why else would that man follow me home and then break into my house to potentially murder me? Trust your gut if something feels wrong. I knew if I opened my door to that man, something terrible might have happened to me. Ever since I was a little kid, all the older men in my family would take me fishing every opportunity they got. It was like some family ritual. I, being the youngest, meant that I was next in line to become an expert, like all of them claimed to be. The ones who took it the most seriously were my dad and his brother Matthew. Our houses were decked out like the ones you've probably seen on fishing shows. I won't go into detail, but if you took a step into my house, you'd instantly be able to tell my parents spend more time on the water than on the land. This is actually his story, not mine. My dad's a pretty hard guy to scare, but let me tell you, whenever he tells this story, it's like he's a different person. He doesn't like talking about it, but every so often, at a family gathering or a special occasion, one of my relatives will ask him to tell it, and he will. My dad's name is John. He was fishing with my uncle Matthew and their close friends Rich, Jeff, and Monty. They had set out early, before the sun had even broken the horizon, heading to a remote spot they had all agreed was prime fishing territory. This place was a couple of hours boat ride from the nearest marina, tucked away in a secluded cove-type area that few bothered to explore. It was known among them for its abundant bass and the occasional pike. The day started like any other fishing trip, with the boat cutting smoothly through the mist rising off the water, everyone sharing stories and jokes over the hum of the engine. They anchored the boat in a familiar cove, surrounded by dense forest. Monty was the first to crack open a beer, even though it was so early in the morning. My dad tells me all the time that Monty is his wild friend, the one who tends to drink a little more than he should. They fished for hours, the only sounds being the occasional splash of a lure hitting the water, and their own laughter. Oh, and the occasional crunch of empty beer cans that they were drinking like water. As the day wore on, they had their fair share of catches, each one sparking a small celebration. As dusk approached, the light began to wane. A dense fog rolled in from the water. My dad describes it as the boat literally being swallowed by fog. Rich, who was the most experienced fisherman of the group, kept saying that he had never seen fog so thick. That's how unnatural it was. Jeff, the jester of the group, was almost as drunk as Monty, both of whom were seemingly unfazed by the fog that had ensnared them. It was starting to get dark. They had originally thought that they could just wait out the fog, but it didn't seem to be going anywhere. My dad and Rich agreed that Matthew should just try to drive the boat out of the cove and into the open ocean, where the fog probably wouldn't be as dense. Matthew agreed, but even though he was typically the most cautious, he only narrowly avoided colliding with the shore. He refused to risk further damage to his prized boat. They reluctantly came to terms with the fact that they'd probably have to spend the night on the boat. My dad made the point that they'd need to tell their families about the situation, and of course, they had drifted into an area of the cove that had no signal. My dad needed to handle some business at work, so neglecting the problem was not an option. He offered to go ashore in search of a signal, and Rich and Jeff said they'd join him. Matthew would stay back to guard the boat and an increasingly inebriated Monty. My dad, Jeff, and Rich made their way over to the shore and jumped out of the boat, only getting slightly wet. My dad made a point of snagging the emergency flares in the boat, just in case they got lost and needed to signal Matthew to come find them. The three of them made their way into the pitch-black woods, lit only by the shine of their phone flashlights. My dad and his friends have all done their fair share of camping, so it wasn't like a forest scared them too much. They began trekking uphill, hoping that higher ground would give them a better chance of finding a signal. My dad always made a point of emphasizing how dark, yet eerily foggy the forest was. You could practically feel yourself slicing through the fog. Just as they were adjusting to the dense atmosphere, a series of strange clicking noises began to permeate the silence, first emerging from directly in front of them before encircling them completely. These sounds were unlike any forest sounds they were familiar with. It was rhythmic yet erratic, as if someone was tapping out a code meant only for the woods themselves. The distinctiveness of the noise made one thing clear: it was human-made. The realization that they weren't alone hit them like a freight train. Rich, the most seasoned of the trio when it came to outdoor survival, whispered urgently for them to turn off their flashlights. "Don't give away our position," he hissed, with a note of genuine concern in his voice. As the lights switched off, the darkness became thicker than the fog. The clicking noises stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that seemed to weigh on their chests. Time lost meaning as they stood there, frozen, unsure of their next move. I'm sure they were all thinking the same thing. The idea that they might have stumbled upon some kind of clandestine gathering or a woods cult was terrifying. Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the silence was broken by rustling noises, this time much closer. Then silence again, and then a guttural scream echoed through the trees. A sound so primal and full of anguish that it rooted them to the spot. Before they could process what was happening, rapid stomping noises thundered through the woods towards them. The three men took off, back the way they had came. Acting on fear and pure instinct, my dad fired the flare gun behind them. The flare cut through the fog, lighting the woods up. For a moment, the woods were as clear as day, and the sight that met their eyes was nothing short of horrifying. Illuminated by the flare's red glow was a pack of more than 10 individuals dressed in what could only be described as tribal attire. Some of them brandished wooden spears, but the light from the flare only lasted a split second. Jeff screamed and almost stumbled, but Rich quickly grabbed his arm to keep him upright. My dad describes this part as the most overwhelming feeling of pure terror he has ever experienced. The forest seemed to fight against them as they fled, ducking under branches and jumping over roots. By some miracle, they emerged from the tree line, panting and disoriented but alive. They screamed at Matthew to start the engine, the urgency in their voices leaving no room for question. Matthew complied immediately, and the boat lurched forward just as their pursuers reached the shoreline. In the chaos, my dad fired the last flare into the air, back towards the shore. For a split second, as the flare's light pierced the fog, they saw their pursuers at the water's edge. It was freakish. There must have been at least 15 of them, just standing motionless at the water's edge. The flare's light faded, and it was dark again. Matthew managed to get a safe distance away, and stopped the boat again. After the engine was off, the only sounds were Jeff, my dad, and Rich's breathing. My dad says he wasn't able to process what had happened for nearly an hour. He was functioning off pure adrenaline and survival instincts. They ended up taking turns keeping watch while the others slept, and left first thing in the morning as soon as the fog dissipated. Funnily enough, Monty had passed out before everything went down and doesn't remember any of the details of that night. I still get shivers down my spine when I tell this story. I can only imagine what my dad must feel when he thinks back to it. I've been fishing for as long as I can remember. I'm almost 60 years old now, and even though I've been fishing thousands of times, I can't think of any other way I'd rather spend the rest of my life. My kids are all off living their own lives, and things around the house are quiet now. You could hear a pin drop most of the time. Sometimes I miss the old days, being able to throw the pigskin around with my boys in the backyard, but some things just aren't in the game plan anymore. I usually fish with my pals from college, but more often than not, I found myself going at it alone, like a lone wolf. This was one of those times. I haven't stepped foot outside upstate New York in over 15 years. I don't see a reason to. We've got some of the best fishing lakes in the country, and I plan on making full use of them. It was mid-April in the early season, just after the ice out and before May hit. For whatever reason, I decided I wanted a more secluded spot this time around, so I chose a nondescript lake in the middle of nowhere that was pretty small. I drove up an hour before sunrise so that I could be out on the water when the sun poked through. I unstrapped my kayak from the roof of the car and made my way over to the lake. I rode out to the middle of the lake and admired the beautiful early colors starting to paint the sky. It felt like home. You can bet your bottom dollar I'd never trade a day like this for anything. It was a little chilly, but I've got skin like steel. I could tell the sun was just about to appear in the sky, so I started gearing up. I was shooting for largemouth bass, so I made my way back to the outside edge of the weed beds, planning to move back toward the middle of the lake if I got skunked. I went for a 6.5-foot medium action spinning rod with 9-pound monofilament line. I was using a wacky rig, which is a 4-inch rubber stick worm, my go-to for catching largemouth. Just before I was about to start what would hopefully be a swell day on the water, I noticed something strange across the lake. I couldn't quite see what was going on, but I could tell that there was movement. At first I thought it was a fellow fisherman, but curiosity got the better of me. I reached into my knapsack and pulled out my pair of binoculars I used for bird watching. I looked across the lake, and there were 3 figures wearing dark colors and hoods covering their faces. They looked like they were digging a hole or something on the edge of the lake. I kept watching. They finished their hole, and while I was expecting them to put something inside it, they actually did the opposite. One of them pulled something out of the hole, which I couldn't make out even with my binoculars. Then the other 2 did the same, pulling out a few more things that I couldn't quite see. I was beyond confused. Then I watched as they started tossing the items into the lake, each one making a distinct splash as it smacked the water. Something was wrong. Out of nowhere, a wave of fear washed over me. I didn't know who these people were, but I started thinking they might be dangerous. I didn't know what to do. Thankfully, they started to leave without noticing me. I thought about turning a blind eye, but couldn't bring myself to do it. I waited until they disappeared into the woods, and slowly rode my way over. I was shaking at this point. I got to the spot where I was pretty sure they had tossed everything. I started fishing, only this time I wasn't fishing for fish. I was going for something else entirely. I fished around for about an hour with no luck. I had to try something different. I racked my brain, trying to figure out what I could do. And just then, I remembered my depth checker. I had it tucked away in my Volvo. I was determined at this point. I rode back to shore, returned to my car, retrieved the depth checker, and rode back to the spot. I was sweating heavily at this point. I poked around for a bit, feeling nothing but squishy lake bottom. And then, I felt something hard, something metal. I made a mental note of the spot and grabbed my rod. I took the rig off and replaced it with the largest hook I had. I let the spool out slowly, my pointer finger feeling the gentle movement of the line. 50 years of fishing experience was going into this one catch. I felt the slight resistance in the line. It had hit something. I moved the line around slowly, hoping I'd be able to snag it on whatever was down there. After about a minute, the line tugged a little harder than was normal. I was snagged. I reeled in slowly, careful not to drop my catch. What I pulled out of the water had me shivering in my boots. I stared at the black 9mm on the end of my line. Those thugs had thrown a gun into the lake. I didn't feel safe anymore. I didn't even bother looking around for the other items. I reeled the gun into my kayak, careful not to touch it, and hightailed it out of there. As soon as I got to dry land, I called the police. They launched a full investigation and recovered several more unsettling things from the lake. I insisted on watching them conduct their search because I needed to know what was at the bottom of that lake. They found a keychain with like 7 keys on it and a bunch of old, foreign coins from different countries wrapped in a cloth. The most eerie thing they found, though, was a locket. It was waterlogged, so the pictures inside were faded and unintelligible. The police told me they'd contact me if they ever connected these dots to some kind of crime. They never called me, though. But the story didn't end there. One night, I don't remember how many days after this incident, I heard someone in my front yard say, "That was the car, I know it," and then people snooping around my yard. They never rang the bell or knocked on the door, but I heard multiple people circling my house, and then they just left. I have no idea if it were the same people, and if they were, I have no idea if I'm being watched anytime I leave my house. I alerted the police once more, hoping this would reopen this investigation, but nothing became of it once again. I still have so many questions. Why would those items be buried in the first place? And why would those people go back just to dig them up and hide them again? Maybe they realized that there was a greater chance they'd be found in the ground, so they went back and threw them in the lake. Or maybe those items had been in that hole for years, and they decided to dig them up for some reason. All in all, this was the strangest thing that has ever happened to me while fishing. Throughout my life, I would go through phases of different hobbies. I'd pick something that interests me, obsess over it for a year or so, and then find something new to keep myself entertained. During the summer of 2022, I was big into fishing. About an hour's drive away is a shore house my family has owned for decades that's on the water with a lagoon and small Boston whaler. My friends and I would take frequent trips there to fish and just chill. It was the following October after summer when my two friends Kevin and Arian decided to hit the shore house for a weekend to try to catch some striper, as they're abundant during the fall months. Kevin was an avid fisherman, which was a big reason why I got into the whole fishing craze in the first place. Unfortunately, during this time, our boat was out of the water due to maintenance, so we'd have to fish off the beach and piers. This was no problem though, as Kevin had all the necessary rods and gear to do so. We got together on a Friday afternoon, and I drove us all down. When we got there, we fished during the day off of different piers along the inlet. Night rolled by, and only one of us had caught fish, which was Kevin, of course. It was just a small bass though, nothing too exciting. Bummed about our luck, we decided to stay up late to fish off the beach during the night. Kevin said he knew a good beach spot about 15 minutes away, which took us down a desolate road with woods on both sides. It opened up into a small gravel parking area, or at least what seemed like one. Kevin said since we'd have to walk a little ways to the spot, we should take everything we need now so we won't have to go back to the car to get anything. We planned on staying up to catch the sunrise, so we packed accordingly. We walked about 5 minutes down this path, which opened up into a massive beach. We set up camp, which consisted of beach chairs, a speaker, and 2 coolers, one filled with ice for fish and one filled with snacks, water, and beers. Kevin brought these massive fishing rods that were ideal for beach fishing, and also rod holders that you would hammer into the sand. He also had these little bells that connect to the tip of the rod to notify you of any movement. We all casted our rods, cracked a couple beers, and played the waiting game. Within 2 hours, each of us had caught decent-sized fish, which definitely lightened our spirits. We were having a great time, music blasting, knowing that no one was around on this deserted beach. Mid-conversation, Arian stopped talking, lowered the music, and jolted his head to the left. He asked if we heard that, to which we replied, "Heard what?" It looked like he was concentrating on something for a second, and then said, "I heard someone yell something." We obviously thought he was hearing things or just joking with us, but he insisted he heard someone yell out something that sounded like a yo or a hey. Either way, it seemed unlikely, given that we were on some hidden beach at like 1 a.m., so he quickly forgot about it, and our conversation resumed. It definitely made us more aware though. A couple minutes later, right after I cast in a fresh hook, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. There was something on the beach in the distance, but I couldn't see what exactly. The others noticed it too. As it got closer, we realized what it was. A person walking towards us. We grew silent and turned off the music. He came up to us. It was a middle-aged white man, maybe 40 or 50. He was wearing a dark blue jacket with a hat and hood up. The way he walked up to us was really sketchy, and he had this intimidating look on his face. We said, "What's up?" kind of awkwardly. He just eyed us down for like 10 seconds and then said in a low voice, "What are you boys up to?" It was pretty apparent what we were up to. Kevin said we're fishing, and he let out some grunt of acknowledgement and nodded his head. He didn't say a word after that and just stood there looking at us, and then the rods, and then the water. We shot each other looks, thinking he was going to try and rob us. There's no way he could have taken on the 3 of us though. The bell on one of our rods broke the silence, notifying us that we had potentially hooked a fish. I said we got one, kind of directed at everyone, but mostly that weird guy in hopes that I would get some response out of him like a normal person. I walked over to the rods and reeled in a small striper. When I went back to unhook the fish, that man had turned around and left. We watched as his dark silhouette faded away into the night. We made sure that we had all of our belongings, then sat and just talked about how odd that encounter was. He left without harming us though, so we concluded that he was just some weird man who is now thankfully out of our business. We kept the music off just to be cautious and cracked a few more beers as our conversation transitioned to different topics. At one point, while staring into the horizon, I thought I heard something in the distance. It took me a second to realize what it was, but when I did, my heart dropped. It was a car alarm. I knew it was mine. It was the only car in that lot, and no houses were out there for probably miles. We started panicking and decided to run back to the car, leaving all of our stuff behind. It took us a couple minutes to get there, and when we did, I was completely distraught. My tires had been slashed, and my driver's side window had been shattered. I got on my phone with the police immediately and told them my location and situation. The operator asked if I knew who may have done it, and we said some sketchy guy came up to us as we were fishing. She asked if I knew where he went, and I said no. Just as I said this, we heard rustling in the woods around us. My heart rose into my throat. I felt trapped. We frantically ran like 200 yards down the road and hid in the trees. I told the operator this, and she said to stay hidden and keep quiet. Within 10 minutes, we saw 2 cop cars speed past with their lights on. We ran back to the car and saw 3 officers searching the area. Multiple things had been stolen, including my wallet, some cash that was in the glove box, and the remainder of Kevin's fishing gear. They found a large knife lying on the ground nearby, which they took for fingerprints and evidence. I told them the whole story with my adrenaline still pumping. They said we were smart to run away and hide, as it's very likely this man meant us harm. Those words made me appreciate my life so much more. The officers made us feel safe, and were nice enough to help us pack up the equipment and carry it back. They took down our information and gave us a ride back to the house. We stayed up all night reflecting on what had just happened. That morning, Arian got us a ride up north, and I picked up my car from the shop a few days later. To this day, this is by far the most frightening experience I've ever had. What was supposed to be a normal fishing trip became a terrifying ordeal that cost me hundreds of dollars worth of damages. I never got a call back from the police, meaning that guy is probably still out there. Needless to say, I gave up fishing as a hobby and haven't touched it since.
We are sorry. The number you have dialed has been...
In 2015, student Michael Andrews of the University of Southern California had left his dorm room with his roommate Steve to go to a frat party off campus. On the way to the party, Steve had realized he left his phone in the dorm room, but already in the Uber to the party, they didn't bother going back to the dorm. At some point during the party, while the 2 friends had separated to mingle with other friends and acquaintances, Michael's phone began to ring. It was from Steve's number. He picked up and heard Steve's voice on the other end, covered by a mask of static. Even in the loud party, he could distinguish the voice of his roommate saying, "Come back to the room." Then the call ended. With that, Michael left the party and Ubered back to the campus dorms, trying to call Steve back and text him, but he wasn't getting any responses. When Michael got back to the dorm room, he didn't find Steve inside. Strangely though, he did find Steve's phone sitting on his bed. Upon checking the notifications on the screen, Michael saw the notifications of all his texts and calls on the screen. It wasn't until an hour later that Steve returned to the room looking for Michael after hearing that he left. And this was when he told Michael that he never called him and that he never had his phone. What made this even stranger was that Steve's phone had no record of making a call to Michael, yet Michael's phone had a record of receiving a call and having a 15-second conversation. The phone company wasn't able to trace a call from Steve inside, and nobody was found hiding in their dorm room or anything like that. In 1970, 25-year-old Donna Lass worked as a nurse at the first aid station of a casino in South Lake Tahoe, California. One day, Donna's boss and landlord both received calls from an unidentified man who claimed she was dealing with an illness in the family and would be out of town for a while. Donna's boss became suspicious, so he contacted her mother, who confirmed that story was a lie. Donna's car was found parked outside her apartment, but there was no trace of her anywhere. The last sign of her was an entry she'd made in her logbook near the end of her final shift. The entry looked unfinished, as if someone had possibly interrupted her. No one could figure out Donna's whereabouts or the identity of the caller until the San Francisco Chronicle received a mysterious postcard 6 months later. The postcard was the latest in a long line of cryptic messages from the Zodiac Killer. The killer made no direct reference to Donna, but hinted that he had murdered and buried his 12th victim in Lake Tahoe. It didn't take a detective to make the connection between this note and Donna's disappearance. The postcard provided a lot of possible clues regarding Donna's whereabouts, but a search of the area turned up nothing. Something complicates a connection between the Zodiac Killer and Donna, though, and that's the fact that the Zodiac Killer was not known for hiding bodies. So if he wasn't responsible, the whereabouts of Donna's body and who tried to hide her disappearance remain a mystery. In 2008, 19-year-old college student Brendan Swanson was driving home after a night out when he crashed into a ditch on a gravel road in the middle of nowhere in Minnesota. Knowing how dangerous of a predicament he found himself in, and probably aware he was in a cliché horror movie setup, he called his parents and asked for a ride. However, his parents had trouble finding him, and when arriving to the location he provided, they couldn't find his car, so they got back on the phone for over 45 minutes trying to find him as he described his location. Swanson claimed he could see lights from a nearby town and was heading in that direction, but things took a turn for the worse when he suddenly yelled, "Oh shit." Before his father could even scold his son for using that language on the phone with him, the call cut off, and that's the last anyone ever heard from Brendan. Even with hundreds of volunteers and 30 dogs searching, only his car was found. So what happened to him? What did he see that made him go, "Oh shit," before abruptly hanging up? A few years back, a Reddit user named Stacy Kolupski shared the experience of her brother who would get a call on his cell phone around 2 to 3 a.m. every night. He would answer it every time to hear this hellish sounding noise that he described as a static mixed with screams. He changed his cell phone number after a month of this and it stopped. Then after a week or so, it began again, with the exact same noise at the exact same time. Finally, one day he decided to backdial the call, and an old man picked up who had no idea what he was talking about. If he didn't answer, it would call a few more times, but no messages were ever left. He decided to say screw it and ended his contract with his phone company, switched to a new one, and then got another new number. And exactly what he feared had happened. The screaming static calls continued after a short delay. By this time he was terrified every night. Unsure why this was happening, he backdialed the number again and got a different person, who also had no idea what he was talking about. Around this time, Stacy's brother lost his job and his phone, which was now disconnected, meaning the calls of course stopped. One day, Stacy's mom asked her to listen to a weird message she got on her home phone. It was the static screaming. They showed her brother, and he of course freaked out. He backdialed the number again, and it said the number was disconnected this time. They never heard from it again after that. In the 1970s, Bashir Kaushaki opened a successful restaurant in Washington, D.C., and for over a decade enjoyed nothing but success. But in 1983, he became the target of a non-stop stream of threatening phone calls that came several times a day, every day. Usually harassment similar to this will eventually stop on its own as the harassers get bored and move on to something else. But Kaushaki was harassed by these phone calls for nearly a decade. The caller would eventually be nicknamed l'enfant, which is French for the child. The nickname was presumed to reference the caller's eventual imitation of a little girl. Anyone associated with Kaushaki in any way was a target, from his pregnant spouse to his restaurant employees. The harassment was one day elevated from simply phone calls to physical harassment when the Star of David was scratched all over Kaushaki's Mercedes. When he traveled to Philadelphia to visit his sister, things got so bad that he suffered a mental breakdown and committed himself to a psychiatric ward. But even still, the calls continued to his restaurant. The FBI eventually placed a trace on the phone to confirm whether l'enfant was a delusion or not, and what they found out put how bad this was into perspective. The calls were coming from different payphones at such a high frequency that it would have been impossible for only one person to have been making these calls. The L'Enfant callers was a plot orchestrated by multiple people for the express purpose of harassing Kawasaki to insanity, but it was never figured out what the motive was. All the way back in 1931, there was a man named William Wallace who worked as a London insurance agent and had an obsession for playing chess in his free time. One night, Wallace showed up for a chess club meeting and found a telephone message waiting for him. The sender wanted to meet at 7:30 the following night so he could purchase an insurance policy. The next night, Wallace traveled across town and discovered that the address provided didn't exist. So he headed back home, most likely convinced that he was the victim of some dumb prank. But when he got home, he found his wife Julia's body had been beaten to death in the living room. The mysterious caller was the obvious suspect, but after an investigation, police determined that the caller was actually William Wallace himself. Authorities argued that Wallace had left the message to fabricate an alibi. He killed his wife, hopped in a streetcar, drove around for an hour, then went home to supposedly discover his wife's body. This argument was invalid as it was completely impossible for Wallace to have committed the murder, given he wouldn't have been able to return quick enough. The jury found Wallace guilty of the murder anyway, but luckily the Court of Criminal Appeal immediately overturned the conviction. The killer was never identified, but the prime suspect was a former employee of Wallace's insurance firm, who allegedly asked his wife to provide him a fake alibi and was seen wearing bloody gloves and hosing down his car on the night of the murder. Jason Alexander would frequently get calls to his house for a woman named Tanya. It didn't seem like a big deal since Tanya had the same last name as Jason's family and it was a common name from where they were from. When Jason and his family moved across the city and phone books gradually stopped being the go-to way of finding somebody's number, the calls for Tanya gradually stopped, and after a while, the Alexander family forgot about the Tanya woman. It was about 4 years later that she popped up in their lives again. Jason was driving home from work one afternoon and was greeted by a pretty grisly car wreck at the turn to his house. 2 cars had collided, and one had wrapped itself around the signage pole that had the house numbers and directions on it, one of which was his house number. Several days later, he got a call from the police. They asked if Tanya was at his residence. Her car was found wrapped around a pole down the street from Jason's house, and she was nowhere to be found at the accident site. He had never heard anything about her ever again. In 1965, the young woman you're looking at, named Judith Hyams, disappeared from her hometown of Coral Gables, Florida. Everyone feared the worst when her abandoned car was found in Atlanta with blood in the backseat. Judith was pregnant and recently went through a divorce. She allegedly made arrangements to get an illegal abortion from a Hungarian doctor named George Hajdu. He was charged with conspiring to perform the abortion but skipped bail and fled the country. After this, the case was forgotten for a quarter century, until it was rejuvenated by a series of bizarre phone calls. In 1990, the Coral Gables police captain Chuck Smith received a message from an Omaha, Nebraska radio host claiming he had information about Judith's disappearance. Smith called the host back, but the host was completely confused. The host said he never made the call, and he knew nothing at all about Judith. Smith soon received another anonymous call claiming Judith was alive in Omaha. Smith knew nothing about the case, but he had recently traveled to Omaha to deliver a lecture at a police academy, and he started to wonder if this was a prank. Smith got a third anonymous call from someone who claimed to be an FBI informant who had recently spent time with Dr. Hajdu in Hungary. They even provided an old phone number for Hajdu that checked out. Smith was confused, and with such a baffling case, he took the story to the TV show Unsolved Mysteries. Days after the Judith Hyams episode was broadcast, Smith got an anonymous letter confirming what many people suspected all along. Judith died during an illegal abortion and wound up in a watery grave. While that's the logical solution, it doesn't account for all the strange calls. The callers and writer have not been identified, the doctor has not been found, and Judith's body was never recovered. There's a quick check off the highway not too far away from where I live. It's the only thing open 24/7 in my rural, middle-of-nowhere town. It's about a 25-minute drive if I'm speeding, which I usually am, so to translate for all you city folk, it's basically right next door. My sleep schedule is beyond atrocious, so I've been to that quick check more than a handful of times. I like to think I'm pretty generic looking and nondescript, meaning I blend in well, but it wouldn't surprise me if some of the late night workers recognize me by now. This happened just last week, so most of the details are still painfully fresh in my mind. It was past midnight, and I was coding on my laptop. My productivity and focus peak between the hours of 9 p.m. and 3 a.m., so I was in that flow state that any hard worker craves. The problem with late night grinding is that you go from perfectly comfortable to dying of hunger in a matter of minutes, which is exactly what prompted me to shut things down and grab something to eat around the reasonable hour of 2 a.m. Just so you have an understanding of everything, I should mention that the highway leading to the quick check is more of a local road than an interstate, so it's usually pretty dead. The ride there was relatively uneventful. I pulled into the quick check, ordered a sandwich from one of the counters, and roamed the aisles while I waited. The mix of caffeine I'm usually stimmed out on and the ADHD I was born with makes it difficult for me to sit still, so I was just kind of pacing around one of the corners of the store when I noticed something. Facing one of the refrigerators that lined the back of the store was a person sitting crisscross on the ground. It was such an odd sight that I initially overlooked it, then snapped my head back around to make sure I hadn't imagined it. And I hadn't. There was literally a person sitting on the ground at the end of the aisle, facing the refrigerator like he was examining it. I couldn't see anything other than the brown coat and jeans he was wearing. I needed to get a better look at this guy. At his face, at least. So I walked a few aisles down. My plan was to turn the corner really quickly, get a good look at him, then turn back up one of the aisles, ideally before he noticed me looking. Staring at strangers so explicitly is obviously really rude, so I didn't want him to catch me doing it. I was trying to be inconspicuous about it, or at least appear like I was browsing the snacks, but I guess I didn't do a good job of that, because as soon as I turned the corner to look at him, he whipped his head around and stared back at me. His movement was so abrupt that I actually froze up for a few seconds, forgetting what I was even doing there in the first place. And let me tell you, one look at this guy confirmed he was far from normal. Forget about the sitting on the ground and staring into the refrigerator. This guy was definitely on something, which I could tell from his abnormally wide eyes and the way his lip was vibrating, like it was fully quivering, almost as if he were cold, except it was actually kind of hot in there, and he was also wearing a jacket. His posture was all twisted up too, like he was straining instead of sitting, if that makes any sense. But the worst thing by far was the look he was giving me. He wasn't smiling, and he wasn't scowling either. He was staring blankly at me with this dead-eye stare that made it kind of seem like he actually was dead. The whole scene was freaky as hell. After staring at each other for an uncomfortable amount of time, I finally averted my eyes and dipped up one of the aisles, eager to get my food and leave. It wasn't ready yet, though. I stood at the counter and waited. The anxiety was getting to me. So I angled myself to face the corner of the store where the guy had been sitting. I was half expecting him to emerge from one of the aisles, at which point I'm not sure what I would have done, but he never did. Eventually, my food was ready. I promptly left the store without another thought. I thought that was the end of it, but as I was turning to get back on the highway, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I glanced back towards the store and saw a person running full speed from the store entrance to the far end of the parking lot. I was already halfway onto the highway at that point, but as soon as I saw what looked like a brown coat, I knew it was him. As I drove past the quick check, I looked over at it one more time to see that guy was now jumping into a truck. I didn't even want to imagine what a guy like that could possibly be rushing to do at 2 a.m. I was just happy I had nothing to do with it. I sped off, just wanting to get home in peace. After a few minutes, the last of the fluorescent storefront lights faded into darkness behind me, and I was driving through desolate nothingness once again. I'm used to being the only car on the road when it's that late at night, which is why it was so surprising when I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror, but it was even more surprising when I realized the headlights were getting closer, meaning they were going faster than me, and I wasn't exactly driving the speed limit. My first thought was that I was about to get pulled over, so I instinctively slowed down a bit. The headlights kept approaching, and I knew what was about to happen. Police lights were about to start flashing, and my night was about to be ruined. But once the car finally got close enough, I realized it wasn't a cop. It was that guy from the quick check. It was the same car from the parking lot. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I slammed my foot back on the gas and got back up to speed. The guy behind me started flashing his lights at me and honking, and I didn't know what to do. Try and outrun him or pull over and just pray that he'd keep going. I was in a sedan and he was driving a pickup truck, so I figured I could outrun him. The faster I went though, the more terrified I became. I can only describe that feeling as true terror, the feeling that you're literally approaching death. By the time I'd gotten up to 100 miles per hour, the voice in my head was screaming that I was going to die if I kept accelerating. I swerved into the right lane, hoping he'd shoot by me, but instead, he actually swerved to stay behind me. I started slowing down with the intention of pulling over on the shoulder, but the moment I took my foot off the gas, the truck actually rammed into me. I grabbed the wheel to stabilize the car and realized I was in a life or death situation. The guy tailing me was trying to kill me. Everything was happening so fast. I couldn't think. I knew he was going to try ramming me again, and at that speed, I knew I would be lucky not to spin out. I don't know if it was the terror or my survival instincts kicking in, but the moment I saw him go for it, I swerved to the left and slammed on the brakes. The truck shot past me, and I watched as he swerved back and forth a few times before spinning out and shooting off the highway into the field. Despite how violently my hands were shaking and how terrified I was, I forced myself to start driving again. I sped the entire way home. As soon as I got inside, I called the police and reported the incident, although it's not like I could precisely describe where everything had gone down. They took my statement anyway, and I was happy to give it. I know for a fact that Quick Check had security cameras in their parking lot, so I'm pretty confident they'll end up catching that guy. It's only been a week since this happened, but I haven't heard anything yet. My car isn't dinged up too badly, but I still need to get it repaired. As for why in the world that guy had gone after me, your guess is as good as mine. I just hope I never see him again. This happened in the summer of 2022. I was 25 and working what I guess you'd call an unusual logistics job. I was hauling refurbished electronics and custom PC parts for this last-mile delivery startup that was trying to compete with Amazon in weird rural markets. The routes were long and completely erratic. Sometimes I'd be driving for 12 hours straight, often through the night, hitting these remote parts of the Southwest that most delivery companies refuse to touch. The pay was decent enough to make it worth it, and I didn't mind the long drive since I had grown up in a road-tripping type family. This particular night, I was deep into the final leg of a Phoenix to Lovington run. It was around 1 in the morning, and I was winding through this desolate stretch of Route 82, past the outskirts of Lincoln National Forest in southern New Mexico. If you've never driven through that area at night, it's hard to describe how isolated it feels. The road is narrow and poorly lit. You might see another car every 20 or 30 minutes if you're lucky, but here's the thing about that particular stretch. It's also the only accessible route cutting through the area for miles. The GPS alternatives would add like 2 hours to the trip, winding you way north through Carrizozo or something like that. So if you needed to get from point A to point B in that part of New Mexico, you pretty much have to take Route 82. Anyway, I was listening to some true crime podcasts when I rounded this bend and saw a red hatchback awkwardly pulled onto the gravel shoulder with its hazards flashing. I slowed down a bit out of habit. As I got closer, my headlights illuminated a woman standing next to the car. She was holding her phone high in the air like she was trying to catch a signal. My first instinct was to just drive past. I mean, I'm not heartless, but I'm also not naive about the kinds of situations you can walk into in that part of the state at that time of night. But then I started thinking about my own girlfriend or my sister and how I would want someone to stop if they were stranded in the middle of nowhere. Plus, I wasn't completely defenseless. I had a Glock 43 holstered just under my steering column. I never explicitly got permission from the company to arm myself, but given some of the areas we delivered to, It seemed like common sense to me. I slowed down and cracked the passenger window a couple inches. The woman, who didn't seem much older than me, rushed over immediately and tried my passenger door handle, which was locked. She said she needed a ride to the nearest gas station and claimed her car had just died and she couldn't get anyone on the phone. Her voice had this jittery quality to it, like she was either really stressed or maybe on something. I hesitated for a few seconds. The situation felt a little off, but what tipped the scale was knowing I had a firearm within reach. I figured if things got sketchy, I'd be able to handle myself, so I unlocked the door. She got in quickly and gave me this vague and slightly slurred "thank you so much" without really looking at me. The way she slurred her words made me think she was drunk or maybe a little tipsy, which made me a little cautious. Before driving away, I asked her some obvious questions. Had she hit something or did the engine cut out, that sort of thing. But she kept deflecting, repeatedly asking me to just drive. Nothing she said really made sense, and I was leaning towards kicking her out of my car the more she talked. I was about to make a decision when I glanced over at her car one more time. To my horror, a man stepped out from behind it like he had been hiding there the whole time. The adrenaline started to kick, and I turned to face forward. There was another figure that had stepped directly in front of the road about 50 feet in front of us. There was something long in his hands, maybe a bat or a pipe. I couldn't tell exactly. He started moving toward my car, and that's when my survival instinct took over. I floored it. I didn't even try to be subtle about it. The woman whipped around to look back and immediately started yelling. Then she reached down and started digging around in her purse for something. I had a feeling I knew what she was looking for, so before things could escalate, I yelled at her to freeze and drew my gun. I didn't point it at her, but instead just rested it on the steering wheel so she could see it. Whatever she had been reaching for, she stopped immediately. I told her not to move, and she didn't. To my surprise, she stopped talking too. She just stared straight ahead with this expression I couldn't read. Luckily for her, we were less than 30 minutes from Artesia. After a somewhat tense half hour, I pulled into a gas station. There were 2 other vehicles in the lot, both big rigs. I told her to get out. She refused at first and gave me some stupid reason I can't remember, but I leaned across her, yanked the passenger door open, and basically forced her out of the truck. She stumbled back and fell onto the pavement, all the while yelling something completely incomprehensible. Someone started jogging over, probably one of the truckers, and I could already envision the accusations that were about to fly. All that guy had seen was me throwing a woman out of the car, and I didn't want to deal with the situation for a second longer, so I didn't. I yelled out a warning to him about her ill intentions, but that was all I was gonna do. Then I peeled out of the lot before that guy could approach me and didn't look back. I drove to another gas station and started filling my tank. Then I walked over to the passenger side to inspect the seat. Buried between the seat cushions was a burner phone battery and a sealed pack of zip ties. I didn't even want to think about it. I tossed all of it in the trash and got back on the road, eager to be done with the journey. I never reported any of it, not to the police and definitely not to my company. Not because I didn't think it was worth reporting, but because, legally speaking, I didn't really want to explain to a bunch of cops why I was driving around armed or why I'd physically removed someone from my car. I'm not going to get into it, but you can connect the dots on that one yourself. One thing's for sure though, being armed that night may have very well saved my life. This happened about 3 years ago when my husband and I were driving cross-country from Utah to Georgia. Although the route we had mapped out wasn't the most direct, it passed through some places my husband really wanted to visit. The downside of that, though, was that we'd be cutting through some pretty desolate stretches of highway. The worst part was this section of western Kansas along US Route 400, basically 100 miles of nothing but farmland. We'd been driving for most of the day, and I had fallen asleep in the passenger seat sometime around sunset. I'm one of those people who can sleep anywhere in a moving car, so I was out cold for a few hours. Around 10 at night, I woke up to the car slowing down and realized my husband had pulled into this tiny gas station off the side of the highway. My husband said he was going to grab some snacks and fill up the tank. I figured it might have been my last chance for a while to use a real bathroom, so I got out and headed inside. I didn't bother bringing my phone or purse with me. I mean, I was just going to be in and out, so I didn't really see the need. The cashier was this older guy who didn't even look up when I walked in. The bathrooms were tucked down this narrow side hallway toward the back of the store. As I opened the women's restroom door, I almost bumped right into this woman who was coming out of one of the stalls, which wouldn't have been that noteworthy were it not for what she looked like. She had messy, unkempt gray hair that frankly looked kind of disgusting and oddly sticky. She was also wearing these foam flip-flops that made this soft slapping sound when she walked. As if that wasn't bizarre enough, what stood out the most was this thick purple and green coat she was wrapped in. Let me remind you, we were in Kansas in the middle of summer, and it was probably 80 degrees out. She was carrying this tied-up plastic grocery bag, and when she saw me, she just stared. Not like a normal, oh excuse me kind of look, but this locked-on stare that felt weirdly expectant, like she was waiting for me to say or do something specific. I didn't know what I was expected to do, so I just gave her a polite nod and tried to step around her, but she didn't exactly rush to let me through. I figured that was the end of it, that she'd leave me and I could get on with my life. But no, instead of leaving, the woman actually turned around to follow me and stepped toward the sink area. But she didn't turn on the water or look in the mirror or do any of the normal things you do at a sink. She just stood there with her arms at her sides, like she was again waiting for me to do something. I was already feeling uneasy, so I went into the nearest stall and locked it. The second I sat down, I immediately regretted not bringing my phone or anything with me. I had no way to text my husband if something went wrong, and I was starting to get the feeling that something was definitely off about this woman. I sat there for what felt like a few minutes, just waiting for her to leave. Eventually, I heard the soft slap of her flip-flops moving toward the door, then the sound of the bathroom door opening and slamming shut. I waited a few extra moments to make sure she was really gone, and then I realized something. I could still hear breathing. Not my own, someone else's, coming from somewhere in the bathroom. It dawned on me that she had faked leaving. She must have opened and slammed the door to make it seem like she left, but she was still in there, standing silently somewhere near the exit, probably in the corner by the door, just out of my line of sight. I didn't move. I sat in complete silence for a really long time, trying to quiet my breathing because I was terrified at the thought of her hearing me. The whole time, I kept thinking about how stupid I was for not bringing my phone. Eventually, the door was opened and closed again. The breathing stopped too, which sent a wave of relief over me. I still wasn't completely convinced though, so I waited for another half-minute or so. Just as I was about to unlock the stall, I heard a huge gasp, like someone had just been holding their breath, followed by the bathroom door opening and closing again. That's when I truly started freaking out. That woman had pretended to leave the bathroom twice. I had absolutely no idea what she wanted, but the fact that she was playing these games with me made it clear that whatever it wasn't good. I didn't know what to do. Part of me was sure she was gone, but if she had pretended to leave twice, it wasn't crazy to assume she had done it a third time. Finally, the suspense was killing me and I couldn't take it anymore. I unlocked the stall as quietly as I could and stepped out, fully expecting to see her standing there, but the bathroom was empty. I washed my hands as quickly as possible and stepped out of the bathroom. I had no idea where the woman had gone or if she was waiting for me somewhere else in the store. When I got back to the main part of the store, there was this large man checking out at the counter. I lingered by one of the racks near the front until he finished his transaction and walked out. Then I used him as cover to exit the store. I figured if the woman was waiting outside, at least there would be another person around. Part of me thought I was being overly paranoid, but that thought was shattered the moment I stepped outside. As soon as I exited the store, I saw her again. She was lingering off to the side of the front entrance of the store, this time clearly glaring at me. She was holding something in her hand that I couldn't quite make out. It looked like a knife, but I wasn't sure. The way she was holding it though, and the way she was slightly crouched, like she was preparing to spring, honestly made it seem like she was about to attack me. I prepared myself to have to scream or run or even fight, but instead of moving towards me, the woman quickly turned and walked around the side of the building toward the back. I ran to our car and got in as fast as I could. My husband looked confused and asked what had taken me so long. I told him I'd explain once we were back on the road. He didn't question me and just pulled away. As we were leaving, I looked back and saw the woman standing at the edge of the building, watching our car. I don't know why, but seeing her made me so unsettled and uncomfortable. I told my husband everything, and he kinda got mad at me for not bringing my phone with me to call him for help, which was fair. But that was that, and the two of us agreed to try and forget about the whole thing and go back to enjoying ourselves. I will say that I don't use roadside restrooms anymore, which I'm not in the slightest bit upset about. This happened to me in 2020. I was 24 at the time, working for a small logistics company. My job was to deliver automotive parts between cities in the Midwest. Most of the time it was easy work, long drives, decent pay, and nobody breathing down my neck. But that job is also the reason I will never stop at a highway rest area after dark again. It was mid-January, freezing cold, the kind of night where even the dashboard lights feel too bright. I was driving along the I-80 heading east from Des Moines, on my way to deliver a package to Davenport. The drive was about 3.5 hours. I'd left around 8 p.m., and by 10:30 I was in the middle of nowhere. Just the sound of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional semi blowing by in the opposite lane. Around that time, I started to get really drowsy. My eyelids felt heavy, and I could feel myself zoning out. I spotted one of those blue rest area 1 mile signs and decided to pull off for a few minutes to stretch my legs and grab a drink from the vending machine. The rest stop looked completely deserted. A few dim streetlights, a small brick building with restrooms, and about a dozen parking spaces. Only one other vehicle was there, an old white van parked way off at the end of the lot, lights off. I parked under one of the lights, locked the truck, and went inside. The men's room smelled faintly of cleaning solution and mildew. The heater was making a weird rattling noise. I washed my face with cold water to wake up, and when I looked up into the mirror, I thought I heard the door open behind me. I turned, but no one was there. I stood still for a second, just listening, but there was nothing but the hum of the heater. I figured it was just the wind and finished up quickly. When I stepped outside, I noticed something that made me stop. The white van's headlights were now on. The engine wasn't running, but the lights were on. I didn't remember hearing it start. I got this bad feeling immediately. I unlocked my truck fast, then I climbed in and started the engine. I pulled out of the parking space and headed toward the exit. As I did, the van's lights suddenly shut off again. I remember thinking maybe someone was sleeping in there and just accidentally hit the lights. But as I got back on the highway, I kept checking my mirrors. For about 5 minutes, nothing happened. Then, in the distance behind me, I saw headlights, 2 small dots getting closer. It was the van. At first, I wasn't sure, but as it got closer, I could see it was the same boxy white van. No company logo, no side windows, just a dirty cargo van. It caught up to me fast and got right on my tail. I was already going about 75, but the van stayed inches behind my bumper. Then it switched lanes, sped up beside me, and matched my speed. The driver rolled down his window halfway. I could barely see his face, just a shadow and maybe a baseball cap. He motioned for me to roll mine down, but I didn't. He kept gesturing and then pointed at my truck bed, like he was trying to tell me something was wrong. At first, I hesitated. Maybe one of my straps had come loose or something fell out, but then I noticed something that didn't make sense. There was nothing in the bed of the truck. It was completely empty. That's when I realized he wasn't trying to warn me. I kept driving, pretending not to notice him, but he started honking and drifting closer to my lane. I swerved slightly to keep distance, and he sped ahead, cutting in front of me. For a second, I thought he was going to slam on the brakes, but then, without warning, he veered onto the shoulder and came to a full stop. I flew past him, my heart pounding. I stayed in the fast lane, going nearly 90 now, just trying to get away. A few seconds later, I checked my mirror again. The van was back on the road. It followed me for another 20 miles. Sometimes it would fade back until I couldn't see it, Then out of nowhere, it would speed up again and appear right behind me. I decided I needed to stop somewhere public. The next sign said there was a truck stop 5 miles ahead. I took that exit first, pulled into the lot, and parked right under a bright light near the diesel pumps. There were a few semis lined up, and I could see a few drivers inside through the windows of the diner next door. The van didn't pull in immediately. I waited maybe 2 minutes. Then it came slowly up the ramp and into the lot. I got out of my truck and headed straight into the diner. As soon as I walked in, the bell above the door rang, and the woman behind the counter looked up. She was maybe in her 50s. I told her that a van had been following me for the last half hour, and she must have seen how shaken I was because she called over the trucker sitting at the counter. This guy stood up, huge guy, flannel shirt, gray beard. He walked outside with me, and the second we stepped out, we saw the van idling at the far end of the lot, just sitting there, facing my truck. The trucker muttered something like, "Yeah, that ain't good," and told me to go back inside. He walked straight toward the van. I didn't hear what he said, but a few seconds later, the van suddenly reversed, swung around, and peeled out of the lot, heading back toward the highway. The trucker came back, shaking his head. He said there were 2 guys in there, both wearing hoodies, both just staring straight ahead, not saying a word. I stayed in that diner for almost an hour, until I was sure they were gone. I finished the rest of my drive with my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. When I got back to Davenport, I parked under the hotel lights and checked my truck. Everything was fine, but there were 2 smudges on the tailgate, like someone had tried to open it with dirty hands. I quit that job a few months later. Now, every time I drive long distance, I fill up before dark, bring snacks, and I don't stop unless it's somewhere crowded and open 24 hours. Because I know for a fact, if I had rolled down that window or pulled over when they told me to, I wouldn't be here telling this story.
You've got mail.
Number 5. Sandy McNulty, age 27, had just recently gone through a divorce. Within the same month, she signed up for Match.com, and a few days later, received a strange email. The email addressed Sandy by her full name, with a long paragraph explaining that the sender knew of her recent breakup and thought that they would make a great couple. The sender asked for Sammy to get back to him about what she thought. The email was signed anonymously, but there was also a file attached to it. It was a large picture of a man's genitalia. She assumed it was her ex at first, but the picture did not resemble him, and when confronted, he was sincere in telling her that it wasn't him. Plus, she told that he wasn't the type to do anything like this. Sandy continued to receive emails from the anonymous sender, with each one getting more angry and aggressive. She did the best she could of ignoring it, until attached to one of the emails was a picture of the side of her house taken at night. She blocked the sender's email finally, and that was the last she ever heard from any of this. It's still unknown whether it was the ex sending the emails or not. Number 4. A former Reddit user at one point posted a story of a scary email he received. He had one day received a text message from an unknown number telling him to check his email as soon as possible. He obliged and found a message in all capitals titled, "Download this now." It was a short message addressed to the user with his full name, address, phone number, and all. There were 5 files attached, 4 of them pictures, and 1 an exe file titled, "Download this now." Each one of the pictures were very personal to the user. The first one a picture of his house, the second a picture of a very young woman who he eventually recognized to be his mom, the third a picture of him as a baby, and the fourth a random picture of a creepy looking middle-aged man. The user didn't open the exe file. He instead reported the email to the police. It's unknown what the exe file was. The Reddit post was taken down within the same month. Number 3. Father David of a small New York town church had an email address dedicated to his church. He received a strange email with no title, and upon opening it, his computer crashed and he got a blue screen. He would have trouble restarting it until finally successfully logging on to have all his files and data gone, and his screen wallpaper was a large and shockingly disturbing and realistic image of Satan. Internet Explorer, along with other important programs, would not open, and occasionally, a distorted laughing sound effect would play in the background. It's unknown how this was accomplished, but it was most likely just a very cruel prank by a hacker with a little too much time on his hands. Number 2. In the year 2009, a huge wave of emails filled with viruses was spreading across the internet. The email titles were innocent enough. For example, some of them were titled, "Free 40% off coupon to Target." However, once opened, a virus would be forcibly installed into the user's computer without their knowledge. These viruses were known to allow all activity on the user's computer to be monitored, sometimes even giving partial or full control over the computers, and sometimes even enabling the built-in webcams to the computers, secretly spying on the users as they used their computers without them ever even knowing. Nobody could seem to figure out how this was accomplished or how to prevent it, but luckily, the swarm of emails eventually died down on its own. Similar swarms of emails have since occurred on a few occasions, but not as dangerous. Number 1. The girl in this story is very sensitive about this and refuses to give her real name, so for the purpose of this story, she'll be referred to as Jen. Jen was attending freshman year in high school. She was a very pretty girl and got the attention of a lot of guys, both young and, unfortunately, much older as well. She received an email from the dean explaining that her grades could be improved and he would like to talk to her about it at some point. Strangely, he left a note at the bottom of the email informing Jen not to respond to the email. A week passed and Jen received another email from the dean. This time, he asked her to meet him at the back of the school at 7 a.m. before classes started. Jen walked to school and went around back this one day and could see somebody poking their head out from behind one of the dumpsters, not the dean. She ran all the way home and the parents reported this to the school. It turned out the dean of the school didn't send the messages at all. The email was traced back to a website that allows you to send fake anonymous emails, and the computer used to send it was the computer in the furthest corner of the local library. Number 8. The Hanging Woman. It was Halloween of 2005 in Frederica, Delaware, and decorations were abundant. The town was ready for the holiday, with cobwebs, jack-o'-lanterns, rubber monsters, and the such. So one more hanging body prop wouldn't stick out too much, right? Well, that's apparently the case. As it turns out, a 42-year-old woman committed suicide by hanging herself from a tree on a rather busy residential road. The body hung 15 feet high without alarm for hours, with trick-or-treaters routinely passing by it, assuming it to be just a decoration propped up on the tree by the owners of the house. It went completely unnoticed that this was a real hanging dead body, all the way until later the next morning, when neighbors caught onto it, at first thinking it was a Halloween prank, but upon getting a much closer look, they could see and smell the body for what it really was. The unnamed woman lived about a quarter-mile away from where her body was discovered. Number 7. On Halloween of 2007, 18-year-old Lisa, a high school senior, was invited to a Halloween house party at her friend Mick's house. There were an estimated 100 students at the party. Mick and a few other students picked up on the fact that there was an unknown, shady-looking character who looked much older than any high school student. None of the students at the party could identify him, but Mick never bothered to ask him who he was or to leave, as when interviewed, Mick said, "I go to parties all the time, and there are always random people showing up. I have even shown up uninvited to parties in the past, so I didn't see how anything bad could happen because of it. I just wanted to know who he was." It wasn't discovered until later that night that Lisa was missing when Mrs. Corrado called Mick's house asking if Lisa was still there. Mrs. Corrado called the police in a panic while Mick and a few of his friends started sweeping the streets in hopes of finding her after calling her cell phone turned out pointless. What they found was completely unexpected. The shady-looking guy from the party was seen dragging Lisa's body through the grass to the woods. When he caught a glimpse of the boys, he fled into the woods, and they were unable to catch him. Lisa was drugged at some point during the party by this man, who still remains unidentified. Number 6. Carl Jackson and his girlfriend were driving through the Bronx on Halloween night when they were aggressively egged by a group of teenagers. Carl got out of his girlfriend's car to reprimand the teenagers, expecting them to run off. Instead, 17-year-old Curtis Sterling pulled out a gun and shot Carl in the chest. Carl was killed instantly. Because Sterling was a minor, he is serving only a 20-year prison sentence. His argument was self-defense, that he was only egging his car for fun, but when Carl stepped out, Curtis assumed him as a threat and opened fire. Number 5. On Halloween night, 55-year-old Chicago resident Liddell Peoples got into a deadly altercation with his girlfriend, 49-year-old Maria Adams. Adams allegedly took a bag of Peoples' Halloween candy, sending him into a violent rage. Peoples took out a knife and repeatedly stabbed Adams, killing her. Upon arrest, Peoples attempted to defend himself by explaining that his candy was taken. As you can imagine, the legal system was not all that sympathetic. He was arrested on a $2 million bond. Number 4. It was Halloween in the year 2001 in Ohio, many kids' favorite night of the year, as they get to run around with friends asking complete strangers to fill up their bags and pillow sacks with cavity-inducing sweet goodness. Now, many kids complain about getting coins or apples or pretzels thrown into their bags, but those things all seem great in comparison to receiving human appendages. It wasn't discovered until late that night when Kathy Jones reported finding a human finger sealed in a goodie bag in her children's candy bag. This may have been the first report to police, but it wasn't the last. The next day, many parents were reporting finding human body parts, including fingers, toes, and even eyeballs in their children's candy bags. Police had to conduct a whole thorough investigation that started with finding out each and every house the parents and kids had been to, and then investigating each home that was visited by all of them. No solid evidence was ever found in any of the houses that may have included foul smell, other body parts, or even just suspicious behavior. It was never determined who could have been the one distributing the not-so-goodie bags. Number 3. If you thought that was all you were going to hear about human body parts, think again. In a small Minnesota town in 1999, an unknown couple was giving away large and heavy paper bags full of supposed treats inside. According to the few unfortunate kids and parents who chose to solicit candy from this house, the brown paper bags weighed anywhere from 2 to 4 pounds, and the woman who answered the door would look to someone hiding behind the door to hand her the bags. It was said that before leaving, the woman would say to wait till they got home to open it. The first big twist to this story is that the couple who was handing out candy at this house didn't live there. In fact, it was a vacant home. When one of the neighbors drove by the house, they were suspicious when they spotted a couple getting into a car that was parked in the driveway and trick-or-treaters walking off the property. When the mysterious couple had driven off, said neighbor went to warn parents not to take those bags. They opened one of the bags to see what was inside, to find a human hand. Apparently only 3 to 6 bags were given away, each one containing hands. 2 left hands and 1 right hand were found, meaning at least 2 likely dead bodies were needed. And the big question is, where and how did this unknown couple get them? Number 2. A disabled war veteran was parked outside of a Florida fast food restaurant in his wheelchair on Halloween night. When a Marine dressed in a tutu saw him, he assumed it was a gag. He was offended and enraged, apparently thinking the man was dressed in a costume mocking war veterans, and he ended up brutally attacking the half-paralyzed veteran, beating him to the ground and knocking him unconscious. It wasn't until the police came to arrest him that he learned of his mistake. Number 1. In 1986, a 9-year-old boy whose name has never been disclosed by his parents for privacy reasons went missing on Halloween night after being given permission to go trick-or-treating alone by his parents. After a long and hard search, the devastated parents reunited with their child as they caught him walking up the stoop at 3 in the morning. He was surprisingly happy and was so excited to tell of the stories he had to share. He said a man had stopped his car and told him to get in for a lot of candy, and the man took him back to his house. This man allegedly took the boy down into the basement, and the two played many games, one of which the boy called "Touch Me Where." The boy also said the man asked him to give him everything he was wearing, including undergarments, and in exchange gave him fresh new clothes. After hours worth of horrific explanations as to what went on in that man's house, The boy received a ride back to the other side of his block and was told to walk home from there. The parents and police tried to get the boy to lead them to the house, but all he kept saying was, "I don't remember." As far as anybody knows, this mystery creep is still out there.
I was living alone in a small rental house just outside town when this happened. It was a one-story place at the end of a short dead-end road. There were only 5 houses on the street, and at night it was usually quiet. I worked from home doing freelance graphic design, so most days I didn't leave unless I had to get groceries. I didn't get visitors often. My friends usually texted before coming over. That's why the first knock stood out. It was around 8:45 at night on a Thursday. I was in the living room watching TV when I heard 4 firm knocks on the front door. I muted the TV and waited, thinking maybe I imagined it. Then there were 2 more knocks. I got up and walked to the door. There's a small peephole in the center of it. When I looked through, I saw a man standing on my porch holding a medium-sized cardboard box. He was wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap. He looked normal, maybe mid-30s. I opened the door but kept the chain on. He immediately said that he had a delivery that required a signature. He read a name off a small handheld device. It wasn't my name. It wasn't even close. I told him he had the wrong address. He looked down at the box, then at the device, then back at me. He read the address out loud. It was my exact address. I told him no one by that name lived here. He stared at me for a second longer than necessary. Then he said he must have been given the wrong information and would take it back to the truck. I watched him walk back down my driveway. I expected to see a delivery van or at least a car parked somewhere nearby, but there was nothing. He walked past my mailbox and turned the corner at the end of the street. I didn't see where he went. I shut the door and locked it. I told myself it was just a small company delivery or maybe a contractor driver without a marked vehicle. The next night, at almost the exact same time, there were 3 knocks again. This time I didn't open the door right away. I went to the peephole first. It was the same man with the same jacket and box. I didn't open the door. I just spoke through it and told him he already came by and that no one with that name lived here. He didn't answer right away. Then he said he just needed a signature and that the system showed the package had to be delivered tonight. I told him I wasn't signing for someone I didn't know. There was a long pause. Then he said okay and stepped back from the door. I stayed at the peephole. Instead of walking away right away, he stood at the edge of the porch looking at the house. He slowly turned his head toward my front windows, then toward the side of the house, then back at the door. After about 15 seconds, he finally walked down the driveway. Again, I saw no vehicle. That's when it started to feel wrong. On the 3rd night, there was no knock. I actually felt relieved. I thought maybe he figured out the mistake. I even joked to myself about how weird it would have been if he showed up again. On the 4th night, I was in the kitchen washing dishes around 9 p.m. when I heard 4 knocks. It wasn't on the front door. It was on the side of the house near the dining room window. I slowly walked into the dining room and looked toward the window, but no one was there. Then there were 4 more knocks at the front door. I went to the peephole, and it was him again. But this time he wasn't holding a box. His hands were empty. I didn't say anything, and he knocked again. Then he stepped back and looked directly at the peephole. I stepped away from the door so he couldn't see movement, and I didn't make a sound. After about 30 seconds, he turned and walked away. I waited 5 full minutes before checking the windows. I walked around the house with the lights off and looked through the blinds. I saw him standing across the street near the tree line. He was just standing there facing my house. After maybe a minute, he walked off into the darkness. I relocked every window and door again, even though they were already locked. The next day, I called the local police non-emergency line and explained what had been happening. The officer I spoke to said it sounded like someone trying to verify occupancy. He said sometimes burglars will knock to see if someone answers before trying to break in later. He told me to install cameras if I could and to call 911 if the man came back. That night, I left all the lights off in the front of the house and stayed in my bedroom. Around 8:45, right on time, there were 4 knocks. I didn't respond at all. After a few seconds, 4 more. Then silence. I waited about a minute. Then I heard something else. A soft thud against the back of my house, and then another. I realized it sounded like someone testing the back door. I grabbed my phone and quietly walked into the hallway. I could hear the back doorknob turning slowly, and then stopping, and then turning again. I called 911 like I was instructed and whispered that someone was trying to get into my house. While I was on the phone, the knocking started again at the front door. The dispatcher told me officers were on the way. The back doorknob kept turning. There was more than one person. Then I heard the sound of something metal scraping lightly against the doorframe. After about 30 seconds, everything stopped. Even as it was totally silent though, I stayed on the phone until the police arrived. When they searched the outside of the house, they found fresh pry marks on the back door near the handle. The officer told me if I hadn't been home, the door likely would have been forced open. They drove around but didn't find anyone suspicious. The next night, I stayed at my brother's apartment across town. I didn't tell anyone on social media or anything that I wasn't home. I just left. Around 9 p.m., my phone rang. It was my neighbor from 2 houses down. She said there was someone standing on my porch knocking repeatedly. She said he had been there for at least 5 minutes. She asked if I was home. I told her no and asked if he had a vehicle. She said she didn't see one. I told her to call the police. Officers arrived and questioned him. Later that night, an officer called me and said the man claimed he was trying to deliver a package, but he misplaced it. He had no company ID and no marked vehicle. They warned him to stay away from the property. 2 days later, police arrested him in a nearby neighborhood after he was caught attempting to break into a house where the owner was out of town. In his car, they found multiple empty cardboard boxes and a small handheld scanner that wasn't connected to any real delivery company. During questioning, he admitted he would knock with a fake package first. If someone answered, he would leave and mark the house as occupied. If no one answered after multiple attempts, he would come back later and force entry. He told detectives that sometimes he would knock several nights in a row to see if the pattern changed. If lights were on one night and off the next, he assumed the house was empty. Hearing that made me realize how close I was to not being home that first week. If I had ignored the door on one of those early nights, he probably would have come back later expecting no one inside. I moved out of that house 3 months later when my lease ended. I still don't answer the door at night unless I know exactly who's coming over. If someone knocks unexpectedly, I stay quiet and check cameras first. And if anyone ever shows up with a package that has my address but not my name, I don't even go near the door anymore. This story starts in the lead up to Christmas. To set the scene, I live near Glasgow in Scotland. I stay with my parents, siblings, cats, and dogs. We're a close-knit family and often spend nights together in the living room watching TV, playing games, and catching up on our lives. At the time of this story, I was 16 turning 17. I was in high school, but getting closer to leaving and starting my education outside of it. In the days leading up to Christmas, during one of those late nights together, we were watching A Christmas Carol. We often have movie nights around Christmas, and it's one of my favorite things about that time of year. During the movie, we heard a knock at the door. This wasn't unusual, so we didn't think much of it. My mom got up to answer it, but nobody was there. The street was empty. Our garden wraps from the front of the house around to the back, so she checked along the side of the house too, but there was nobody there either. She came back inside, and we resumed the movie. A few days later, I was sitting at the living room table doing exam work when I heard another knock. I paused my work and went to answer the door, but again, nobody was there. We assumed it was probably neighborhood kids playing a prank. Where I'm from, kids sometimes get bored and cause trouble instead of finding something better to do. In Scotland, there's a game called Chappie, where kids knock on someone's door and run away laughing. It's stupid, but as a kid, the adrenaline rush of someone opening the door to nobody there can be weirdly fun. We have a family group chat where we keep each other updated on things, and throughout that week, several family members mentioned experiencing the same thing. The one that stood out the most was something my dad experienced. At the time, my dad usually stayed up later than everyone else, either playing Xbox or watching shows once the house was quiet. One night around 11:30, when the street was silent and all the kids would have been inside, he heard a very quiet knock. He was confused because of the time. He checked through the peephole before opening the door, but he saw nobody. He slowly unlocked and opened the door to look outside. Again, nobody was there, just a quiet, empty street. He locked the door and came upstairs to ask if anyone had heard it, but because the knock was so quiet, nobody else had. This started to unsettle us because it had been happening repeatedly. Nobody had ever seen or heard anyone outside except for the knocking itself. Usually when kids do this, you hear them laughing or running away. This felt different. Christmas Day is when everything escalated. We spent the day with family, opening presents, sharing gifts, watching movies, playing games, and eating way too much food. It was a great day. Later that night, I felt sick from eating so much, which I always do Christmas, so I went upstairs to lie down. I ended up dozing off and woke up hours later. When I checked my phone, it said 2:01 a.m. Everyone else was in bed and the house was completely silent. I knew I wouldn't be able to fall back asleep because once I woke up, it's hard for me to sleep again no matter what time it is. I stayed on my phone in the dark scrolling social media instead of turning the TV on, watching Christmas present haul videos and messaging friends who are still awake. It's normal during Christmas break when there's no school or responsibilities and you try to enjoy the freedom before going back to exams and routines. After a while, I heard a faint knock. I wasn't sure if it came from my door, my window, or if I imagined it. I sat up straight in bed, staring into the dark room with my heart racing. I didn't want to move. I knew nobody should be outside at that time on Christmas night. I didn't know if the past few weeks were just getting into my head, or if someone was actually inside the house. My room is on the second floor, so someone being at my window would be very unlikely. After what felt like forever, I finally worked up the courage to open my bedroom door. As I did, I heard what sounded like footsteps coming up the stairs. My brain immediately assumed it was my dad coming up to bed after staying up late like he usually did. I stepped into view of the staircase to tell him I was still awake and heard the knocking again. That's when I realized it wasn't my dad. It was a man I'd never seen before. I immediately felt sick when I saw him. I wondered if this was the person behind all the knocking. He was already inside the house. He was staggering as he climbed the stairs and looked heavily intoxicated. I slowly backed into my room, luckily without him seeing me, and I quietly shut my door. I could hear him walking around and opening doors, going into each room one by one. I remember thinking it was only a matter of time before he reached mine. I completely froze and didn't know what to do. It felt like all my common sense disappeared. Eventually, I opened my door slightly and saw him coming out of my younger sister's room. That's when my brain finally kicked back into action. I ran to my parents' room and woke them up, telling them there was a man inside the house. My mom woke up instantly while my dad was still groggy. We went downstairs together and found the man passed out on the couch with my dad's beers opened and scattered around him. My mom shouted at him to get out. He woke slightly and angrily insisted the house belonged to him. We tried to get him up, but he was completely dead weight. My mom slapped him trying to wake him, but he barely reacted. A few minutes later, my dad came fully downstairs, saw what was happening, and immediately took control of the situation. He shouted at the man that this was not his house and threatened him to leave. The man refused. My dad eventually had to physically lift him off the couch and drag him out the side door. He forced him outside and warned him not to come back before shutting the door. We thought it was finally over, but seconds later, glass suddenly shattered toward us. The man had punched through the window, sending broken glass inside. He pushed his face inside the broken glass like something out of The Shining while my dad went to call the police. The man started shouting aggressive threats, saying he now owned the house, that he knew what we looked like, and that he would return. Needless to say, we were all in shock. It was hard to believe someone would do something like this on Christmas night. Eventually he left and the police arrived. They took statements from all of us. Mine was the longest since I had seen him first. Not long after, the police left. Luckily, because it was the winter, it had snowed that night, which is actually rare where we live since we usually just get slush. There was a clear trail of blood leading down the street. Police followed it to a nearby playground where they found the man lying on the ground with blood and glass in his hands. They arrested him after, and later confirmed they believed he was the intruder. Our window was replaced the next morning. We told my siblings what had happened. Surprisingly, they slept through the whole thing, probably knocked out from all the Christmas food. Later, I got a restraining order against the man because of my age and the threats he made. He was fined for the damage and given community service instead of jail time. When police questioned him about the weeks of knocking at our door before the incident, he claimed he knew nothing about that and denied ever doing it. It turned out, he actually lived in our house years before we moved in. He claimed there was no bad intention and said he had simply drank too much while out with friends and accidentally went into the wrong house. Thankfully, nobody in our family was seriously hurt. The only injury was my mom bruising her wrist from slapping him while wearing bracelets. Apparently that hurts you more than the person you hit. To this day, we still have no explanation for the knocking that happened before that night. Even now, sometimes I feel like I hear a knock late at night. Maybe it's just in my head, or maybe it isn't. I guess I'll never know if it was him or someone else out there watching. This happened around 2010 when I was about 6 years old. My family and I were living in a small neighborhood in Springfield, Oregon. It was my older brother, sister, my mom, and I, as my dad was deployed at the time. I was really close with my dad and always took it hard when he was away. Late one night, I sat on the porch with my mom while she smoked a cigarette and we watched the rain. While we were sitting there, cold but enjoying the rain and each other's company, we noticed a man walking in the middle of the road. He was wearing one of those oversized yellow rain jackets. It immediately caught both of our attention because it was pouring rain really late and there was no one else usually out at that hour. We sat there watching him as he began walking slightly toward our driveway. My mom stood up, grabbed my hand, put her cigarette out, and we watched as the man stopped walking right next to our garbage cans in our driveway. My mom turned to take us inside and the man began yelling at us. I don't remember what he said, but I remember being so terrified as my mom rushed me inside. As soon as we got inside, my mom locked the door and turned off all the lights. At that point, I was terrified, and of course, being a kid, I started crying. My mom rushed my siblings and I, shushing us, and we all went and laid in my parents' king-size bed together as we were all a bit worried. But nothing else happened. There was no more yelling or noise or anything, so we all drifted to sleep. That night, I had a terrible nightmare I can still picture to this day. It was of a man in a big yellow rain jacket peering through our window. I woke up terrified and crying, literally shaking my sister awake just so I could tell her I was scared. I have no idea how much time passed. My sister got out of bed and walked me to the bathroom that was attached to the bedroom. She shut the door and spoke with me while I cried, trying not to wake my mom or brother. But while we were in there, we suddenly heard banging. Loud banging on the front door. My sister burst out of the bathroom and started shaking my mom awake without saying anything, and naturally my brother woke up from the sound too. I sat terrified in the bathroom while my mom motioned for my siblings to join me in there. We watched her walk out of the room toward the front door. My siblings and I were all crying, scared out of our minds, as this man was still repeatedly banging on the door. My mom must have been trying to find her old BlackBerry phone, but seemingly failed, because when she came back, she didn't have it. That meant none of us could call the police since this was the only phone in the house. We sat there in silence listening to the man, who was now screaming and yelling for us to let him in while still banging loudly on the door. It was honestly a really hopeless and fearful night. It was just the 5 of us with no phone to call the police, and my dad, who is normally our protector, was gone. We sat there on the floor huddled together, freaking out and praying our neighbors would call the police, but nothing happened. Eventually the man left, but no police ever came. What was strange is that it was a small neighborhood where everyone lived close together, and our house specifically was a duplex, so how not a single neighbor heard this and called the police is beyond me. Eventually, we went to sleep, and everything was okay for a while. But not even a few weeks later, still just the 5 of us at my home, my family woke up to my front door wide open, along with a window open and a huge hole cut into the window screen. My mom immediately called the police. There were lots of random items missing, including my piggy bank filled with all my holiday savings, along with random items around the house. But the most disturbing thing missing was a giant vase filled with cash and coins that my family had been saving for months. The sickening part was that it had been on my nightstand right next to my bed where we were all sleeping. This was a long time ago, and sadly my mom has since passed, and my dad wasn't there when it happened, so I'm not really sure what other details I might have missed. I do know that the intruder was never caught. I also don't know if the same man who was harassing us that night was the same person who broke into our house weeks later. It could be connected or it could not be. I do know that none of us were harmed, which makes me feel like maybe it wasn't the same person, because that man seemed really aggressive for someone who just wanted money. But on the other hand, I later found what looked like the same giant vase sitting on the porch of a neighbor who was a man that lived alone and that we never really saw. So honestly, who knows? This happened to me almost 3 years ago, almost to the day, while I was in Idaho serving a full-time mission. The town that me and my companion, who I'll refer to as Spencer, were assigned to was quite small, so there wasn't always a lot for us to do, and on top of this, at the time, I was going through a rough patch. Things like self-esteem issues and having trouble sleeping, so as a result, we found it difficult to stay out all day doing work. One other thing about where we were assigned was that we were living in an actual house, albeit a tiny one. Usually we only ever get apartments, but I guess for this area, a house was the only option, probably because there were no apartments anywhere nearby. The layout of the house was fairly simple. As you walked through the front door, you entered the main room where our desks were, and immediately to your right was our bedroom. If you kept walking straight, you would walk through a large open doorway that led right into the kitchen. From there, to your right was the bathroom, and to your left was the laundry room. And that was it, besides one storage closet in the kitchen as well. One other detail was that although the house technically stood on its own lot, the landlord's house was right next door, and anytime we had problems with something, we could just walk over or call him. On this particular night, I was sitting in the living room at my desk on my phone with my chair turned to face the kitchen, and Spencer was sitting in the bedroom on his phone. It had gotten dark outside a couple of hours earlier, so we returned home and were just relaxing before we went to bed. In the middle of whatever I was doing, I heard a single knock come from the window above the sink, and because of the layout of the house, where this window was, you could basically see the whole living area where I was sitting. I looked up at the window for a few seconds, but only saw darkness. I went back to what I was doing and began to think that it must have just been a branch or something. There were large trees behind the house, but the more I thought about it, the more unlikely it seemed. None of the trees were close enough to the house to brush the window that way, and it wouldn't have made a knock sound like the one I heard. In the middle of having this thought, I heard another knock around the corner at the window in the laundry room. The full weight of what was happening was finally coming into focus, but my mind was still looking for an explanation that didn't conclude that someone was outside circling the house, stalking my companion and I. I started to tell Spencer what I had heard from the living room, but as I was, another knock came from the window in the living room, the one right next to me. I didn't see who it was on the other side, and I didn't want to. I jumped up and ran into the bedroom and locked the door. I asked Spencer if he heard it too, and he said yes. We started debating what to do. All we had for weapons were a couple of knives, and we didn't know how many people were actually out there, or if they were armed, so going to confront them on our own was out of the question. During our discussion, the knocking sound moved from the window in the living room to the front door itself, and we were getting more and more freaked out. We briefly debated calling the police, but we were in the middle of nowhere, and it would take them forever to get out there to help us. Then Spencer remembered we had the landlord's number. He called him and began explaining the situation, and by this point, we hadn't heard a knock at the door for a couple of minutes or so, but I knew what that meant, and I was dreading it when it finally came. A knock at our bedroom window. The blinds were closed, so we couldn't see who it was, and they couldn't see us, but that didn't make me feel much better. Spencer told him someone was stalking the house, and he said he would be right out with a shotgun. We waited for another few minutes, anticipating another knock, But nothing happened until finally our landlord came to the door and announced himself. We asked him if he had seen anyone, and he said no, but that he saw a pickup truck speeding away as he approached the house. I asked if he had gotten a license plate or any other features that could help the police, but he said they had already been too far away for him to see anything. Spencer and I grabbed our flashlights and circled the house with him. There were small patches of snow on the ground from a weather system that had come through a few days earlier, and in the snow, we saw footprints indeed circling the house, and as far as we could tell, there was only one set. We debated calling the police, but we knew that they wouldn't be much help in tracking the guy down. The landlord said to call him again if the guy came back, and with that, we went back into the house, locked everything down, and tried to sleep, but we couldn't. The first thing that came to mind was other missionaries playing a prank on us. But if that was the case, then why didn't they reveal themselves or say gotcha or something like that at some point? Also, it was past curfew. Everyone was supposed to be home, and the closest missionaries to us were at least 20 minutes away. The other possibility was that it was some teenagers from the ward playing a prank, but that didn't seem likely either, especially afterwards, because again, they would have come back and started laughing at us. And there was only one set of footprints we found. If it was a prank, I feel like that would have been a group thing to do. After the fact, no one ever fessed up when we did some asking around. So to this day, we still have no idea who was outside or why they chose to harass us. But the scariest thing to me wasn't the knocking or how the only thing separating us from him was a thin layer of glass, but the fact that I likely looked right at this guy when he first knocked on the window in the kitchen and didn't even know it. From that day forward, my sleep only got worse, nothing worked, and my own personal issues did not improve either. I'm not sure I'll ever go back to that house. My name is Thomas. I've been working the late shift at our local Burger King for about 2 years now. It's not glamorous, but it pays rent and the hours work for me. I'm a night owl anyway, so being behind the drive-thru window from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. doesn't bother me the way it would most people. This all started maybe a month ago. I was working the drive-thru solo. We're usually understaffed after midnight, and that's when a car pulled up to the speaker. Male voice, pretty unremarkable. He ordered a large double Whopper with cheese meal with a Coke. It was pretty standard. The one notable thing about the encounter was when he went to pay, he only rolled the window down just enough to slide his card through, and his windows were tinted so I couldn't see his face. He paid and I handed him his receipt, but then he just drove off, like without stopping at the second window to grab his food. I waited there with his bag for a few minutes, wondering if he'd be coming back. Eventually, I just set the order aside and ended up eating it later. People do weird stuff sometimes, so I didn't think about it too much. About a week later, it happened again. It was the same order and the same exact thing happened. Someone paid at the first window and then drove off before picking up the food. I remember thinking, that's strange. Someone did the exact same thing last week. But I wasn't quite able to connect the dots at that point. I just figured it was a coincidence. It wasn't until it happened a third time that I realized it was the same person making these orders. At that point, I knew something weird was going on, but I wasn't going to complain. The food was made, paid for, and I was the one who got to enjoy it, so I kept eating the free Whopper meals and tried not to think too hard about why some random dude was essentially buying me dinner every few days. This went on for a few more weeks. The guy would show up every 4 or 5 days, always late, usually between 1 and 3 a.m., and always with the same order. I started to almost look forward to it in a weird way. Like, it's been a few days. Wonder if my mysterious benefactor is going to show up tonight. One night, I was working the speaker at around 2 a.m. when I heard that familiar voice through the speaker. I knew what was about to happen, and I was right. He ordered the same meal, which I knew I'd be eating. But this time, he said something else. Something that made me freeze up. He said, and I'll never forget this, "I hope you've been enjoying those Whoppers, Mr. Hurley." My last name is Hurley. I don't wear a name tag with my last name on it. It's not posted anywhere customers can see. There's no reason at all that this guy should know my last name. I just stood there for a second, not saying anything. My brain couldn't catch up. Then I started talking into the speaker, asking who this was, what he wanted, and how he knew my name. I must have said "who is this" 4 or 5 times, but he never answered. And this time, he didn't even pull up to pay. I heard his engine rev, and then he was gone. I was rattled for the rest of my shift. There was nothing I could do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Little did I know, things were about to get much worse. When I got home after my shift, I found a note on my doorstep. It was a handwritten note that said, "I know what you did. You have 3 days." I just stood there staring at it with my hand shaking, and I started feeling really, really sick, like someone had punched me in the gut. I have no idea what I supposedly did. I've been racking my brain trying to think of anything that could explain this, but I've got nothing. This sounds so stupid, but I don't have enemies or secrets. I'm a 24-year-old guy that works at Burger King and plays video games on his days off. I'm not exactly living the most exciting life. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I just sat on my couch with the lights on, dreading whatever was going to happen next. But nothing happened. I had no choice but to just move on. It turned out I wouldn't have to wait that long, because the next night at work, that guy was back. This time, he didn't even bother playing games. Instead of ordering food, he just asked me to write something down. Then, before I could even respond, he gave me an address. It was some random place on the outskirts of town, in an area I didn't recognize. And then he told me I had 2 days to deliver him $10,000. I damn near laughed at that. I didn't think he was serious, but he clearly wasn't kidding. As soon as he drove off, I immediately went back to being terrified. There was absolutely no way I'd be giving that guy $10,000. I didn't even have $10,000. I still don't. So I decided to ignore it. I figured it had to be some elaborate scam or prank from someone I knew. I should have called the police right then, but I didn't even think of that. 3 nights later, I thought things were over. I hadn't dropped any money off, and nothing had happened. But of course, I was wrong. I was sitting there watching TV, winding down from my shift, when out of nowhere, I was jolted up by the sound of shattering glass. I hit the floor on instinct, thinking someone was shooting at me. But when I finally got up and looked around, I realized someone had just thrown a rock through my window. By the time I went to look outside, whoever had been there was long gone. This time, I called the police. I told them everything, including the address I had been given, and they said they'd check it out and told me to stay vigilant. They really didn't do much, they just told me they'd patrol the area a little more closely, and that without any doorstep footage, which I obviously don't have, there was nothing they could do. And that was 3 days ago. I've called in sick to work the last 3 nights, but I don't even think that's going to do anything since the guy clearly knows where I live. I can't afford to not work, and I can't afford to move, so I'm stuck in this nightmare until the police can track that person down. I think I might try getting them to track the credit card number that the guy used to pay for the Whopper meals, but other than that, I'm not really sure what to do. Why I got targeted, I have no idea. Hopefully things don't escalate from here. I graduated from college about 8 months ago with a degree in communications, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, has been incredibly useful in helping me secure gainful employment. That's sarcasm, by the way. I'm still living with my parents, and I haven't been able to find a real job yet, so I'm off to a great start. In the meantime, I drive for Uber and Uber Eats, sometimes both in the same night, depending on what's popping. It's not a career, but it's money, and it lets me feel like I'm doing something productive while I figure my life out. I know that sounds kind of pathetic, but it's what I've got right now. I drive mostly on weekend nights, Friday and Saturday, usually from around 9 p.m. until 2 or 3 in the morning. That's when the surge pricing kicks in and the drunk college kids need rides home from the bars downtown. It's not technically a night shift, but it feels like one. This happened a few weeks ago. It was a Saturday night, maybe around 1:30, and I was about ready to call it. I was about to turn off the app when one more request came through. The pickup was downtown, which was fine, but the drop-off location was really far away, past the suburbs even. I almost declined it for that reason, but the fare was too good. The girl I picked up was completely normal. The drive took about 40 minutes. By the time I dropped her off, it was past 2, and then I was alone, out in the middle of absolutely nowhere with a 40-minute drive back to civilization. I turned the car around and started heading home. Not 10 minutes into the drive, I saw a car stopped in the middle of the road with its hazards on. I approached cautiously, and I realized there were 2 people standing in front of the car, waving their arms like they were trying to flag me down. My first instinct was actually not to stop, but I'm someone who can't just ignore a person in need. So against my better judgment, I decided to stop. I stopped the car about 20 feet away from them and rolled my window down a few inches. Just enough to hear them, but not enough for someone to reach inside. It was a middle-aged couple, which actually put me at ease a little. That is, until they started talking. The woman did most of the talking. She had this frantic energy about her, but also something that felt slightly rehearsed, like she'd given the speech before. She said they were warning drivers about a collapsed bridge ahead. She went on to say it happened earlier that day, and they'd almost driven right off themselves. She pointed down the road into the darkness, and said if I kept going that way, I'd end up in the river. So naturally, I asked them what I should do instead. The husband spoke of a turnoff that was about halfway between where we were and the bridge. He said it cut through the woods and that it would add some time to my drive, but it would get me back to the main highway without having to deal with the bridge. I thanked them and started driving. Something felt off. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing. I was going to trust my gut and just drive the way I had been intending to go. About a mile down the road, I saw the turnoff they'd been talking about. It was this narrow dirt path that disappeared into the trees, and it was barely wide enough for one car. I decided to keep driving, and a few minutes later, I reached the bridge. I slowed down a little, but it was fine. It wasn't collapsed for sure, and it didn't even look damaged at all. I drove across it without any issues and made it back to the main highway a few minutes later. Even though nothing happened, the experience stuck with me to the point where I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I'd followed that couple's instructions, if I'd turned down that dirt road alone in the middle of the night. A few days later, the curiosity got the better of me and I did something stupid. I drove back out there. It was the middle of the afternoon this time, broad daylight, which made me feel slightly less insane about the whole thing. I retraced my route from that night. Those people weren't there this time, obviously. When I got to the turnoff, that dirt path into the woods, I slowed down and pulled over. To my surprise, there was something new. There was a sign nailed to a tree right at the entrance of the path that simply said, "Dead End." That sign hadn't been there before. I would have definitely noticed it that night, even in the dark. Someone had put it up in the last few days. I sat in my car for a minute, staring at the path. In the daylight, it didn't look quite as ominous. It was just a narrow dirt road that disappeared into some dense trees. I wanted to explore it a little, but I was worried about my car getting stuck, so I decided to go it on foot. I'm not sure what I was expecting to find, but being that there was daylight out, I really wasn't scared at all. I turned off my engine. As soon as I stepped out of the car, though, I got a bad feeling. I stood there at the edge of the path, trying to see further down, but there wasn't much to see, really. I don't know what it was, but something about standing there and actually being out in the open discouraged me from walking in. Things went from 0 to 100 in about 2 seconds. As I was turning around and walking back to my car, I heard a scream ring out behind me. It was this awful scream, definitely a woman's, and it came from somewhere deep in the woods down the path. I can't tell you how fast I was out of there. Before I could even think, I was already speeding away. I don't think I've ever been so scared before, and that was about 2 weeks ago. I haven't been back to that spot since, but here's the thing. I can't stop thinking about it. Part of me knows I should just leave it alone, but I've been thinking about asking one of my friends to come out there with me. If I do, I'll record a video and send it, but for now, all I can really do is wonder about that scream and those people. This happened a few winters ago when I was working overnight security for a commercial warehouse complex. I was 26 and had been doing the job for 8 months. The shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and I was always the only employee on the site. There was a supervisor I could call if something went wrong, but for the most part, it was just me and the cameras. The complex was in an industrial area on the edge of a small city that didn't have much nightlife. Most nights followed the same routine: clock in, do a walkthrough of the exterior, then settle into the security office to monitor the cameras. And every hour, another patrol. The warehouse stored mostly industrial equipment and bulk supplies, nothing particularly valuable. The night everything went sideways started pretty normally. It was cold enough for there to be snow falling, but nothing too heavy. I did my first patrol, everything was secure, and I went back to the office. Around 1:30 a.m., I got a motion alert on one of the loading dock cameras. This wasn't unusual. The system was sensitive, and wind or animals could trigger it. I pulled out the feed and watched for a minute, but everything looked normal. Just the empty dock and snow drifting past the floodlights. But the alerts kept coming. Every 10 or 15 minutes, the same camera would trigger. Each time I'd check the feed, and each time I'd see nothing. What started to bother me was that the movement always seemed to happen just at the edge of the frame, like something was there but not quite in view. By 2:30, I had maybe 6 or 7 alerts from the same camera. No other cameras were triggering, just that one. At 3 a.m., I went outside to check it myself. The snow had mostly stopped, and the complex was dead silent. I walked the full perimeter of the dock area with my flashlight. I didn't see anything unusual. All the bay doors were closed and locked, and there were no footprints in the snow except for mine. I went back inside. About 20 minutes later, I heard a loud, metallic scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across concrete. It came from inside the warehouse, somewhere deep in the building. I checked the interior cameras, but all 6 feeds showed empty aisles. I was starting to freak out a little bit because I started feeling like I was being toyed with, or watched somehow. But still, I explained the noise away by chalking it up to the wind or something. An hour later, though, I heard it again. It was louder this time. The dragging sound, followed by a sharp bang, like something had struck one of the interior doors. I cycled through the cameras again. Nothing on 1 through 5. When I got to camera 6, though, the feed was black. Maybe 3 seconds of static, and then it came back. But something was different. The angle had shifted, just a few degrees to the left, like someone had bumped the camera or adjusted its position. At that point, I had no choice. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed into the warehouse. The interior was massive, probably 80,000 square feet of industrial shelving arranged in long aisles. During the day, it was bright and full of forklifts. At night, the overhead lights were dimmed to save power, casting everything in this yellowish half light. I was maybe halfway down the main aisle when I heard footsteps coming from somewhere to my left. It definitely sounded like someone, a person walking maybe 2 or 3 aisles over. As soon as I stopped, the footsteps stopped too. I stood there trying to control my breathing. I remember how tense it was, standing there in complete silence, waiting for a sound that I wasn't even sure would come. After what felt like forever, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to break the silence. In a firm voice, I announced my presence as security and insisted that whoever was there make things easy and reveal themselves. But of course, there was no response. The rest of that patrol was utterly terrifying. I was bracing myself for a fight or some kind of confrontation, and the longer I surveyed without finding anyone, the worse that feeling got. But I ultimately finished my patrol without seeing another person, which was arguably worse because I knew with 100% certainty that there was someone in there. I didn't see or hear anything for the rest of my shift, but that didn't make me feel any better. I actually felt somewhat guilty. My job was laughably simple, and I was messing it up in real time. But by the time 7 rolled around, I wanted nothing more than to just get out of there. I reported everything to my supervisor when he showed up on site. Maintenance did a full inspection, but didn't find anything either. Even after everything was double and triple checked, no one was able to identify the method of entry, and I could tell people didn't believe my story. Still though, that night remains one of the freakiest things that has ever happened to me. This memory still terrifies me, and outside of police and some close family, this is my first time fully revisiting it. A few years ago, I had gotten my first job at a 24-hour gym. At the time, I was in a gap year between high school and college, so I worked a lot of night shifts. The gym was open 24/7 and accessed by key card only, meaning often there were only 1 or 2 employees working. People could just check in, use the equipment, and leave. The whole facility pretty much managed itself. All entries, exits, and usage of equipment was processed digitally, so all I had to really do was sit in the office and keep an eye on the cameras. I would occasionally get up and walk around, do some light cleaning, and even talk to some of the guests. This was in a pretty bad part of town, but for the most part, everyone was nice and friendly, and it was one of those gyms where everyone kind of knows each other considering how few people really come in. This one night in particular, I was working from 8 p.m. until 6 a.m., which is generally a very long, boring shift, but everything that happened that night keeps me up at night to this day. It was around 2 a.m. when I had already done multiple rounds around the building and finished all routine paperwork. I was exhausted, so I just figured I'd sit down for a bit and monitor the cameras. Everything was normal at first. Not many people come in to work out in the middle of the night, but there were a couple regulars who came and went. I had worked here for a few months now, so almost everyone I recognized, except one man. I first noticed him when I saw him using a treadmill in the far corner. Normally this wouldn't catch my attention, as we have new guests from time to time. However, what really caught me off guard was how fast this man was running. I pulled up his treadmill number in the system, where I'm able to live monitor all equipment activity. He was running 9 miles per hour, which was impressive already, but what really shocked me was the fact that he never stopped. 10 minutes went by, then 15. He never slowed or stopped. I looked closer at the camera, and although I can't quite describe it in detail, this man was nothing short of unsettling. He was wearing ragged clothes, he had long, messy hair, and his face never moved once. He was just staring straight forward. Then I noticed his feet. He was barefoot. He had been running 9 miles per hour for 15 minutes barefoot, just staring into the distance. At this point in time, I was very weirded out, especially since he was now the only person in the building besides myself. I pulled myself together and realized that we do have a policy requiring shoes, so I decided I would use that as an excuse to go talk to him. Although his appearance really freaked me out, I got up the courage to leave the office and head out to talk to him. The machine he was on was located almost directly outside the employee hallway, and as soon as I turned that corner, my heart stopped. The treadmill was covered in blood. His feet were tearing apart as he ran. My heart dropped. Blood not only dripping, but splattering from his feet and ankles for every step he took. His face was still stone cold, staring straight ahead. His mouth was wide open as he ran. He looked like he was on every drug on the planet. At this point, I was terrified. He looked crazy enough to the point that my gut was telling me he was dangerous. However, I still mustered up the courage to yell at him to stop. I can't even remember exactly what I said, but I did have to raise my voice a bit so he would hear me over the thudding of his feet as he sprinted. He didn't say a word, or even turn his head for that matter. He just continued to sprint and stare forward with his mouth open. I yelled again, something along the lines of, "Hello, what are you doing?" He then muttered the words, "Are you there?" in the coldest, raspiest voice I've ever heard. He wasn't out of breath or even panting as he spoke. I told him to stop a few more times, and he repeatedly just said, "Are you there?" The pool of blood at the end of the conveyor was growing, and at this point, I just figured I'd call the cops. I went back to the office, picked up my phone, but before I called, I glanced at the monitors again. He was staring directly at the camera, sprinting, bleeding, mouth open, staring at the camera. I turned away and then heard him screaming from outside the door. He wasn't even screaming words, just screaming at the top of his lungs as he stared at me through the camera. Suddenly, he hopped off the treadmill. He didn't even turn it off, and he sprinted out of view of the camera. I immediately started clicking through the feed searching for him, but he was out of view of every camera we had in the building. I had checked every camera except one, the employee hallway. Sure enough, there he was, about 6 feet from the office door, just standing there. I don't even know how he had gotten into this hallway without a key card, but I didn't hesitate to quickly lock the door. Almost 5 seconds after I locked it, The doorknob rattled. Now I was calling the cops. He started screaming again and shaking the door as I explained to dispatch what was happening. They told me police were 5 minutes out, as I just waited in the corner of the office while this man was trying to get inside. His scream was terrifying. It was so deep it barely sounded human, and he kept it up for an unbelievably long time. This went on for about 3 minutes. I thought if he got in here I was gonna die, and I felt absolutely helpless. Suddenly though, the screaming stopped and the door didn't move. I checked the cameras again and he was gone. I couldn't see him anywhere. Eventually, the police arrived and I made them search the entire place before I would even leave the office. They told me he was nowhere to be found. I answered their questions and drove home. I quit the next day and have not entered that gym since. I have no idea what that man wanted, or what kind of crazy he was. I still wonder what would have happened if I didn't lock that door.
My partner and I got a breaking and entering call late one Friday night. I'd never responded to a call like that before, but it sounded serious. A young woman was home alone and heard footsteps downstairs, but when she was on the 911 call, the call was cut before she could give her location in the house. We arrived to the home and entered through the front door, which was left unlocked, which later proved to be how the break-in occurred. Both of us shouted police with our guns drawn, expecting the suspect to be armed. We called out for Anna, that was the homeowner's name. Anna never called back to us. We knew she must have been scared and didn't want to give away her position to the intruder. We checked the whole first floor, which was small and quick. There didn't appear to be a basement. A door shutting upstairs drew my partner and I's attention. I led the way upstairs. All the doors had been shut, so I couldn't really tell which door I had just heard. I told my partner to check that one while I checked this one. I turned the doorknob and kicked the door open, immediately lifting my gun into the air. It was a dark, empty room. I heard breathing in this room, though. It sounded like a woman's breathing. I looked at the closet door, which was slid slightly open, and I saw half a face, mostly someone's eye, peeking through the opening. Resting assured it was Anna, I lowered my gun and said, "Anna, it's okay, you can come out." But she didn't, and the breathing quieted. Then my partner in the next room over called, "Jason, I found her." My feeling in that room suddenly went from at ease to ready to throw up. I raised my gun again and yelled, "Come out of the closet." They did not obey, so I called my partner into the room. He turned on the light and we opened the closet together to see this disheveled, drugged-out woman holding one of Anna's kitchen knives. With 2 guns pointed at her, she dropped the knife and we brought her into the precinct. Thank God I was stationed in a safer area of town the next year, and I haven't gotten any breaking and entering calls since then. As a state trooper for 15 years, I've experienced my share of close calls and uncomfortable situations. This happened over a decade ago when I was still relatively new to the job. I was on night patrol on an interstate about 2:30 a.m. I usually had my car parked near a bush to hide myself from view from oncoming speeding cars, but at this hour I didn't really try to hide too much. I was moving my car and pulled into a gas station that sat on the side of the interstate. It was closed, not because it was late, but rather it was temporarily out of service. I noticed 2 cars parked in the lot next to each other. There was nothing immediately suspicious about this, but I kept my eye out just because strange things happen at this hour. I parked my car in a way that I could watch the interstate as well as these 2 parked cars. I realized that I didn't see anyone in either of those cars though. Now this was quite suspicious. The station was closed and there were no workers here. I exited my car with my hands on my belt and approached the 2 cars. I tapped on the windows for the both of them. Nobody in either of them, as I suspected. I began to walk around the lot as the occasional car zipped down the interstate. I went up to the glass of the closed gas station and knocked on it. I turned around, dumbfounded. Whose cars were these? Just as I imagined they could be in the woods somewhere, I heard someone running from around the building and ask for my help.
He was some young 20-something-year-old man, like me at the time. He said his car wouldn't start and needed help. Now, I told him right away that I was no mechanic and that he'd need to call a towing company, but he practically begged me to just check under the hood for a second. He ran to his driver's side and popped the hood. I looked under the hood with him, not really knowing what to look for because I wasn't much of a car guy at the time. I asked if his battery died, and when I looked at him, I took note that he was looking around very oddly. He replied, "I don't think so." I then looked at the car parked next to him. "Whose car is that?" I asked him. He said he didn't know. He simply parked there to see if there was a porta potty in the back or something. I was reading through this kid's bullshit. Something was up here. As I looked back at the guy from the two cars, I saw him looking back at something or someone. I turned and saw another guy approaching me with a knife in his hand. I unholstered my gun and aimed it at him. He dropped the knife and put his hands up. They both did. I immediately called for backup while keeping the two at gunpoint. I cuffed the one who was holding the knife and placed him in the back of my car, and then grabbed the second pair from my glove box and cuffed the second guy. When backup arrived, I went to the back of the gas station where the first guy had originally approached me from. What I found there still holds up to be the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen in all of my years as a trooper. There were two fresh, dead bodies wrapped in garbage bags, cut up in two pieces each to fit in the bags. Along with them was also a shovel sitting on the concrete by the woods. The two were planning on burying the bodies somewhere in the woods off the interstate, and it seemed they were in a hurry. These two were a couple of the dumbest people I had ever interacted with, being that out of anywhere in the state, they chose to bury two bodies off an interstate behind a gas station. Going to sleep at night knowing you almost had your throat slit by somebody on the job messes with you, and I didn't get much sleep for a while. I'm a rookie cop currently working the night shift. I'm just a normal patrol officer conducting traffic stops and responding to basic 911 calls. 2 nights in a row last week, I was called to the same house. Dispatch had called me to check out the house as someone had dialed 911 and hung up. The house was a couple miles from me, in my patrol zone. I arrived to the house quickly and turned up the dirt driveway through the trees onto the property. The house was dark, no lights on, no cars, nothing. I parked my squad car on the far right side of the property and went to the front door, taking note that all the windows were properly shut. I knocked on the door and no answer. The door was also locked. For my immediate guess, the place was abandoned, for years by the looks of it. I called to dispatch that the place was abandoned and nobody was there. Then I left. The next night I was working the same shift, and around a similar time, I got a call from dispatch that there was another 911 call from the same house. Only this time, someone could be heard crying on the other end before the call ended. I was asked to check out the house again. This time I was a little further away, but still the drive wasn't too bad. I pulled up the dirt driveway again onto the property, and again, no lights, no cars. I approached the front door again, and this time it was left cracked open. I knocked on the door while holding the doorknob to prevent the door from pushing open. No answer. I called to dispatch that I would be entering the house, which I was cleared to do since the crying over the line implied an urgent situation inside the house. I drew my gun and entered the house. I tried to find a light switch without luck. I had my gun in one hand and now my flashlight in the other. The house was mostly silent, besides this sound coming from behind a closed door. It was the basement door. I called to dispatch for backup in a whisper. The sound coming from down in that basement was a tone, like a dial tone of a phone. I started walking down the stairs as quietly as possible. I got to the bottom and followed the noise of the dial tone to an old, early 2000s style landline speakerphone. The phone was off the hook, and it was playing the dial tone on speakerphone. I put the phone on the hook to silence the noise. It was almost as if it were planned to happen like this. As soon as the phone hit the hook, I heard a muzzled laughing type noise in a far corner of the basement. I turned around and there was some guy standing opposite me in the basement with his hand over his mouth, and he appeared to be laughing, but it wasn't this genuine laugh. It was more like a sickly, mentally unstable laugh. The guy was holding something in his other hand. I couldn't see what it was at first, but when he raised his hand up to his head, I realized he was holding a revolver. I aimed my gun at him and yelled to drop the weapon. He paused as he had his revolver to his head, apparently about to pull the trigger, so I shot him in the arm twice, causing him to drop the gun. He screamed in pain as I cuffed him and brought him upstairs. I requested a medical team at once. A second squad car pulled up, as did an ambulance a few minutes later. The scariest part about this for me was not that I had to shoot a man in the arm twice, but that I was mere seconds away from seeing a man spray his brains out onto the wall. My partner and I got a radio call of a welfare check, which is just a check on the welfare of a person. A woman's ex-boyfriend called because he received text from his ex stating that she wished it had never ended and that she could no longer go on without him. We get to the place, knock, pound, etc. No answer. We call the number the ex provided and get an answer and a hang-up, so we hear it from the outside window and know she's in there. We say we're going to break the door down if she doesn't answer. We hear some slurred mess of speech. Door unlocks but doesn't open. We open the door to find a young woman, wet, naked, pale as hell, and swaying in one spot. Her hands bleeding. We call a rescue ambulance and she's off to the hospital. Now to the creepy part. None of the lights would turn on, so we conduct a safety search and find candles lit in the bedroom and bathroom. On the walls were Bible scriptures written in her blood and a tub of brown water, the water being mixed with old blood. I don't know how she survived because that water was dark. She had been sitting in it for approximately 3 to 4 hours. Before getting transferred to a different county, I used to work as a police officer in Burlington, New Jersey. Burlington is not a safe place. They say that crime there is 88% higher than the rest of Jersey. And having worked there for a year, I got to learn that firsthand. Now, there would be a lot of break-ins, robberies, assaults, and after a while you'd get used to those calls. Sometimes you'd get pretty strange, unsettling calls though. This was one of them. Most Burlington locals are familiar with the McNeil Mansion, a long abandoned mansion that sits right on the Delaware River. The home was constructed in 1894 to serve as a residence for Andrew H. McNeil, as well as his wife and 4 daughters. The house had been abandoned and left to decay since 1974 and is now owned by the county. Sometimes there would be kids trespassing on the property to check it out. Sometime past midnight, I was told over the radio by dispatch to investigate the property, as there was a report by a neighboring house that there were some people seen hopping the fence to the property. Upon entering the property, I noticed a light coming from inside one of the upstairs windows. Part of me inside died a little as I realized someone was in there and that it was my job to go in and get them out. I requested backup into my radio and stated I would be entering the mansion to pursue a trespasser. I scanned the outside of the house once more looking for an entry point and found one of the lower windows was smashed open and easily accessible, and that's how I made my way in. Right away, first thing I did was make my presence as a police officer known. I was inside what appeared to once be the living room of the mansion, rubble covering the whole floor. I heard footsteps upstairs. I shouted again, expecting them to come down the stairs. When they didn't, that meant it was my job to come up. I went up the stairway and started walking around. There was no way to hide my steps with all the litter and rubble on the ground. I heard something fall in a nearby room. This is when the worry and fear really started to kick in. At this point, I had my hand on my gun holster ready to react. Though let me tell you, having a gun doesn't make you feel invincible. I shouted again to try and draw out the trespassers from the room. You ever hear that dumb, overused quote, "I didn't sign up for this" in the movies? Well, I was pretty much feeling that exact way. I stepped into the room that I thought was where the noise had echoed from. It was some small, weird room with a bunch of windows with blurred glass film. There was a sliding closet door open about 3/4, so they had to be in there. I took out my pepper spray and gave one more warning that I was a police officer before yanking the closet open fully. It was empty. This made no sense. I looked around the room, and the windows. They looked to an outside deck, and there was someone standing behind one of them. I couldn't see anything about their features other than the outline of their body, but then I realized there were people at the other windows too. The way they were all looking at me through the window film, such a ghostly appearance they gave, like a picture from a kid's horror novel. I found the door to that deck in an adjacent room. When I stepped out, the three figures standing at the windows were gone. I didn't see any other way off the deck besides the door I came out through. I saw the flashing lights of a police car through a bunch of trees, parked on the same lot as me. Another officer announced his and his partner's arrival to me over the radio. I met the officers outside the house and pointed up at the deck where I saw three people standing. They were creeped out as well when I described how they all just stood there at their own windows looking in. We searched the whole mansion together. I eventually came to a small room with a window on the first floor, and once again, something was outside this window. I had to step closer to figure out if it was a person's head or not. When I got too close, the object lowered below the window. I radioed the other officers to go outside with me. We looked around the whole property and didn't find anyone. We searched for another 10-15 minutes before closing up all the entrances to the house and moving on. The scariest part of this for me was definitely seeing three ghost-like silhouettes all standing at their own of the three windows to that deck, looking inside at me.
These are 5 videos with unexplainable background stories. There is an unknown creature in England known as Messie by sewer maintenance. It was discovered during a regular maintenance survey. There had been previous reports of strange happenings in the sewers occurring on other routine maintenance jobs, however nothing as conclusive as this following piece of footage. Workers have been reporting hearing noises from within the tunnels for years. One worker even called the police as he thought someone was stuck in the pipes. The noises have been described as being almost human. One worker described the sounds as being similar to a woman coughing or choking violently. The water company manager has come out and said that several employees have reported sightings of some kind of animal in the sewers. He's reviewed the CCTV footage, and he himself stated that it certainly did not look like a typical sewer rat. It was assumed that the creature was feeding on fat deposits that have built up on the inside of the pipes. According to workers, the creature still remains unidentified to this day. On February 25, 2014, a nude male body washed ashore on a beach in England. The man was wearing only socks and one shoe, but the police made a strange discovery. A set of headphones were found in the man's mouth, as well as a rolled-up sock. The white headphones were looped around the back of the sock and were trailing out of his mouth. A number of items were found nearby, including a jacket, a wallet, and a photo of a young child. The victim was identified as 64-year-old Alan Geel, and the child in the photo was Alan when he was 2. Alan did have surviving family, however he was a loner, so suicide was considered a possibility. Alan had recently purchased a weighted training vest and ankle weights, which suggested that he may have been planning to drown himself. However, these weights were never found, and the unexplained injuries to Alan's chest and head meant foul play could not be ruled out. The day before his body was found, Alan had traveled from Waterbridge to Truro and was seen wandering through the area on CCTV footage. The most intriguing video showed him speaking with individuals at a bus station, but they were never identified. Alan was last photographed in Purenporth on February 24, 2014. The strangest detail from the CCTV footage showed Alan wearing a completely different jacket than the one found on the beach. The jacket that he wore in the footage was never recovered. The rest of his clothing and his bank and credit cards are also missing. No one knows what Alan was doing in Purenporth that night, or how his body ended up in the water. In 2009, Stephen Kosher quit his job in Salt Lake City and moved to St. George, Utah. After months of struggling to find a job, Stephen left St. George on December 12, 2009. The following day, he called two of his friends and claimed that he was in Las Vegas. Stephen never offered any explanation for his trip, but his family believes that he may have been looking for a job. These phone calls were the last time anyone ever heard from Stephen before he mysteriously vanished without a trace. His abandoned car was located in a residential neighborhood in Henderson, Nevada, with wrapped Christmas presents that Stephen had purchased for his family in the back of the vehicle. Investigators eventually found this video of Stephen taken on December 14, 2009, from a camera at a residence in the Henderson neighborhood. The video shows Stephen parking his car, crossing the street, walking down the sidewalk, and then disappearing out of sight. This was the last confirmed sighting of him. It's unknown why Stephen parked his car in the upscale neighborhood, though it's been speculated that it could have been because it seemed like an unlikely place for him to become the victim of some kind of violent crime. His cell phone signal was picked up at various locations by a tower several miles away, but the signal died after 2 days. With his employment and financial difficulties, some people have speculated that Stephen may have staged his disappearance to start a new life. However, there has been no trace of him for about 6 years. The following video is from a surveillance camera taken in November of 2007 in Fresno, California. It was positioned to record the owner's front lawn and was set up because someone had tried stealing something from the owner's yard on a previous occasion. On the night the video was caught, the owner was woken by his dogs barking in an unusual way. He got up and looked at his security monitor and saw the creatures, about 2 to 3 feet tall, moving across his lawn. He grabbed a camcorder and recorded the monitor screen. Local investigators presented the footage at a mutual UFO network conference. The video they shared also showed some footage of the owner and the front yard during the day. Since it's a video of a video, the quality isn't great. The TV show Fact or Faked investigated the video. The crew went to the home it was filmed at and tried recreating it with a few different experiments. In the end, they determined the video footage to be unexplainable. The end of the video also shows some footage of the creatures, that are by the way referred to as the Nightcrawlers, allegedly caught by someone else in Fresno a few years later. The TV show Paranormal Borderline received an anonymous letter in the mail providing enough information to warrant further investigation. It told the story of a worker who appeared to have been abducted by aliens. The letter was accompanied by a tape which allegedly shows the abduction. There are 4 black and white pictures. On the top right quadrants, a worker walks right to left through a gate. He disappears here in a flash of light at 11:16 p.m. The tape continued to run normally until almost 2 hours later. Then the victim reappears in a second flash of light in a fetal position. Then moments later, now crouching, he vomits and seconds later staggers right to left out of frame. According to the author of the letter, the footage was copied from a surveillance system. He reports that soon after the incident, the victim quit his job and moved away. Hired experts couldn't make any valid or concrete conclusions, and there are still no explanations for the flashes, missing time, or just what happened to the worker on that night.